In the beginning there was a man who walked differently than his neighbors, not in the way he dressed or in a manner anyone could easily point to, but in the quiet that gathered around him when he paused to listen. His name was Enoch, and his life threaded itself through a world growing loud with commerce and with the kind of laughter that can hide a hollowness. Where others were loud and possessed by appetite, Enoch moved with a steady attention like someone who had learned to read the weather of the spirit. People noticed it as curiosity at first, then as unease, and finally as reverence from those who felt the weight of what he carried without ever fully understanding it. He lived before the flood, in a time when the earth was fertile and human hearts were turning away from one another, and in that churning world he began to receive a summons that would redefine the line between earth and sky. In a world full of noise, Enoch chose silence. Subscribe and write in the comments what speaks to you more, his peace in the middle of chaos or his call to reach beyond the sky. The summons came not as a trumpet but as an alteration of the air around him, as if the horizon itself had leaned toward his ears and spoken. He was walking one evening when the sky thickened with meaning, and a presence, neither loud nor small, settled into his bones. It was not a voice only, though a voice accompanied it, and it spoke of things that had been hidden in the slow places of the world. The message called him to go beyond the standard tasks of his kin, to step out of ordinary days and into an appointed path toward vision. He would later call this going a kind of ascent, but at first it felt simply like obeying a gravity he could not see. Enoch's first visions were not cinematic flashes but layered perceptions, like the way twilight allows both stars and the outline of hills to be visible at once. He saw the earth as if from a height, and he felt the grooves of the rivers, the tilt of valleys, and the small, tragic pattern of human cruelty fit against the vast patience of the land. There were voices among the trees and in the root-riddled soil, the desperate whispering of those who were being used and those who had turned to using. And woven through these sorrows was the sense of appointed judgment, an inevitable correction that would not be arbitrary but would be measured and measured by a law older than the men who had inched themselves toward power. Enoch heard that law like a sustained note, and it held both warning and mercy in it. He explored his visions slowly, returning to his household and then stepping back again into quiet hours where he would speak with the living memories that lingered like incense. His family watched him, sometimes with alarm, sometimes with admiration, and sometimes with amused bewilderment at how a man would accept such strain without complaint. Yet Enoch was not given to dramatics. He kept a humble stance, and his words about what he had seen were precise and folded with sorrow. He spoke of angels who had journeyed down to see the children of men and had been tempted in ways that revealed the brittleness of the created order. These accounts were disturbing not only for their images but for the way they showed celestial beings bound to consequences, teaching Enoch that nothing in the visible or invisible cosmos escaped the sweep of moral consequence. As the visions deepened, Enoch's attention was drawn to a figure appearing amid the light, clothed in presence rather than in garments, and named by no one at first because words failed to hold the fullness of the sight. Yet the being would be known to Enoch and later told to others as the Son of Man, a title that carried both intimacy and authority. In that first encounter, the Son of Man was not an abstraction or merely a symbol. He was an axis around which the whole vision turned, a focus of judgment and of compassion braided together in a single face. He stood at the convergence of heaven's counsel and earth's appeal, and his coming announced a jurisdiction that was both cosmic and tender. When Enoch perceived him, it was as though the world straightened at one point for the sake of justice, and at another point softened for the sake of restoration. The Son of Man's features were not described as a portrait in the strict sense, for faces and visions are not photographs but living metaphors that disclose character. Enoch perceived a countenance that balanced sternness with mercy, like rain that cleanses without annihilating the soil. Around him gathered light that was not merely illumination but meaning. It made the shapes of things clear and revealed the hidden motives behind actions. There was also an authority in the way he stood, as if he carried the adjudication of history in his posture and the promise of redemption in his hands. Enoch felt small in the presence of such a one, yet he also felt drawn into confidence, as though having witnessed this figure allowed him to participate in a larger story. The narrative that unfolded showed a courtroom that was cosmic in its relevance but intimate in its tenderness. Enoch saw the record of deeds inscribed, not as a list to be flaunted, but as an inventory of broken promises and unchosen kindnesses, the tiny decisions that became the web of collective fate. The Son of Man moved among these pages and read each not with coldness, but with the precision of someone who wanted to reconcile truth with recovery. He called the guilty to conscience and the wandering to home, and in his judgments there was an effort not only to pronounce but to restore, though restoration would sometimes demand radical change. Enoch watched and learned that justice, in the deepest sense, tended toward the repair of community rather than merely its destruction. The scenes Enoch beheld were panoramic, stretching from subterranean caverns where sorrow festered to luminous heights where light seemed to gather like a festival. He saw assemblies of angels, not simply as winged creatures but as intelligences tasked with stewardship, some of whom had erred and fallen into shame because of their proximity to human desire. These errant angels, called watchers in the language of the visions, had altered the human order by teaching dangerous arts and by entangling themselves with the very people they were meant to watch over. Enoch's vision catalogued their crimes not as arcane trivia but as examples of how proximity to power without responsibility corrupts. He recorded their names, their sins, and eventually their fate, not for gossip but to show the pattern of transgression and the moral architecture of the universe that required correction. In the midst of these revelations, Enoch was given the task of scribe and messenger, to bear what he saw back to a world that might yet be turned. The calling was exacting because he had to translate ineffable sights into words hard enough for men to hear. He learned to keep images precise and to shape warnings with compassion, to make sure prophecy did not become mere alarmism. He also felt the loneliness of one who hears a truth no one else wants to receive, and he became familiar with the awkwardness of being present at the margins of every conversation. Yet he persisted, because the visions would not let him rest, not when the fate of multitudes hung in the balance. Enoch's first messages were simple enough to startle a people unaccustomed to thinking beyond daily survival. He spoke of cities that would come to judgment, of arrogance that would be toppled, and of hearts that would be measured. His telling included clear signs and the need for repentance, but he always wove those elements through descriptions of a larger mercy that could be enacted if the people turned. Some listened and were moved, others laughed and dismissed him as a dreamer. Still, Enoch knew his role was not to win every year but to be faithful, to plant seeds that might grow long after he was gone. The visions continued to expand. One night Enoch was taken to a place where he could see the foundations of the world, and there he perceived how the earth was anchored in an order that responded to both human choice and divine ordinance. He saw the pillars that bore up seas and the stores of angels who kept watch over the winds and the stars. The sense of coordination between the seen and the unseen filled him with awe, but also with a solemn duty. Understanding cosmic order meant he could not shrug off the moral conditions that kept it healthy. He returned with the conviction that human sin had a ripple effect, and that vice, like a pestilence, could spread into realms beyond immediate sight. At times the visions took on a judicial tone. Enoch saw courts convened, not to indulge spectacle, but to restore balance. The Son of Man presided with a presence that required no noise. His sovereignty was registered in the silence preceding a verdict, and the gravity that cleansed the atmosphere. Accusations were spoken and heard, confessions were accepted where true, and punishment was designed to prevent greater harm rather than to please the vindictive. Yet the justice rendered was firm. Those who had knowingly twisted goodness into cruelty found themselves placed on paths that led away from life. Enoch's heart ached as he observed the sorrow of condemnation, because even judgment revealed the serious cost of moral corruption. One particularly vivid vision took Enoch to a valley where the names of generations were kept like seeds in a storehouse. He watched as the Son of Man traced letters, and each name unfurled a memory of choices and chances, of mercy accepted and mercy refused. The living names glowed when a life had been faithful in small things, and dimmed where selfishness had prevailed. Enoch learned that divine attention was not superficial. It recorded not only the great deeds remembered by history but the small acts of kindness that escaped human chronicles. In this way, the narrative weighed the ordinary as sacramental, transforming daily smallness into the currency of eternity. The presence of the Son of Man also brought foreknowledge of the coming flood, not as a mere threat but as an instrument of purification that would reset a corrupted system. Enoch's visions unraveled how the flood functioned within the moral economy. It was a consequence that corrected an order overwhelmed by violence and misrule. In these pictures, the waters were not vengeful but resolute, washing away structures of deceit so that truth could reemerge. Enoch felt the heaviness of this destiny, for he loved the people and knew the price of such a reset would be unbearable to many. Yet he also perceived a glimmer of hope, because from the watery blank slate something new could be sown. As his calling deepened, Enoch became a mediator between the celestial and the terrestrial, a bridge that trembled but did not break. He visited thresholds and returned, carrying both words of consolation and stern admonition, and he learned to tailor his speech like a craftsman shaping a delicate instrument. He sought to persuade without coercion, to invite change rather than to coerce it. And when no change came, he did not become bitter. Instead, he documented the failure with an honest grief that added weight to his prophecies. Enoch's life illustrates an important phenomenon, that those chosen to bear revelation often do so amid skepticism, ridicule, and danger. He was not impervious, his family worried, his neighbors mocked, and powerful men feared the destabilizing effect of his words. Yet the very vulnerability of his position made his testimony more credible to some, because it carried no worldly armor nor pretension. He accepted the cost of being a herald because he understood the urgency, and because the vision he carried had hands and a face and a compassion that would not allow him to remain quiet. Among the most arresting scenes was Enoch's encounter with the cosmic archives, where he saw the names of luminaries and rulers etched in an order he could barely fathom. The Son of Man read and weighed each name, discerning between pride that could be corrected and arrogance that needed to be curtailed. Enoch noted how leaders who took counsel with the weak preserved their names with honor, while those who exploited others drew a blotting upon their record. It was a subtle but penetrating lesson about the character traits that endure in the ledger of history. Mercy, humility, and a preference for the vulnerable were written large in the margins of divine awe. In these hearings, the Son of Man often paused to instruct Enoch, not to make him omniscient but to enlarge him with necessary clarity. He taught Enoch that wisdom is not the accumulation of facts alone but the capacity to perceive telos, the end toward which life is moving. With each lesson, Enoch's voice was refined. His prophecies became less about sensationalism and more about the ethical contours of a faithful life. He began to speak in terms people could feel, translating cosmic counsel into responsibilities pressed upon everyday relationships. And so Enoch spent his days traveling the corridors between heaven and earth, sometimes in solitude and sometimes in the company of an angelic escort who showed him things beyond mortal ken. He learned to carry silence as an instrument, to listen before he would speak, and to couch his warnings in consolation. The world he traversed was not monolithic. There were pockets of goodness that surprised him, and men and women who lived faithful lives in unnoticed corners. These glimpses brought him the same joy a gardener feels when shoots appear under a winter crust, for they reminded him that grace persisted even amid decay. Enoch's witness to the Son of Man's compassion reshaped how he understood punishment. He realized that the divine order did not enjoy destruction, and that judgment was a corrective tool, forged for the sake of restoration when possible. This meant that Enoch's messages included lament as well as admonition, and that he often counseled repentance not as a path to escape punishment but as a route toward reconciliation. In his language, the sorrow of human downfall was not a closed book but a place where a new chapter could begin if people would accept the terms of healing. The prophet's life unfolded against the larger backdrop of a world of machines and tools and arts that the Watchers had taught, and Enoch's vision revealed how technology without ethics could become a vector of ruin. Instruments that were meant to serve human flourishing were being twisted into instruments of domination, and Enoch saw how knowledge divorced from humility produced arrogance. He warned that the acquisition of secrets by those without temperance was like giving fire to children. The potential for warmth existed, but so did the danger of burning down a house. Thus his prophecies warned against the misuse of knowledge and insisted on the cultivation of character alongside craft. Enoch also received intimate revelations about time itself. He saw eras unfurl like cloth, each fold revealing consequences born from earlier decisions. The Son of Man taught him that events are not isolated but entangled, and that what one generation does can produce fruits or thorns for the next. This made Enoch a messenger to posterity as well as to contemporaries. His urgency was rooted in the fact that decisions were not ephemeral but enduring. He urged people to consider their children and their children's children, to hold forethought as a moral duty, because the future was not an abstract realm but the domestic ground of human responsibility. Sometimes Enoch's visions turned tender, focusing on individuals whose faithfulness seemed small but whose fidelity would weigh heavily in the scales of the cosmos. He watched mothers who fed neighbors in times of famine, men who refused bribes, and children who showed generosity despite scarcity. Each of these acts glowed in the vision like beacons, small but decisive, and the Son of Man would bend his attention to such moments with the tenderness of one who honors faithful stewardship. Enoch learned that minor acts of holiness could alter trajectories, and he wove these stories into his public addresses to show that salvation was not reserved for the sensationally righteous. There were moments when Enoch felt overwhelmed by the gravity of his task, and in those hours he was given respite through gentle scenes of quiet dominion. He saw fields that produced without greed, households where laughter was a sustenance, and communities that organized around mutual care rather than exploitation. These images were not idyllic fantasies but practical possibilities, sketches of what could be built when people remembered to govern themselves with neighborly justice. They taught Enoch that prophecy included not only admonition but also the articulation of a positive vision to inspire action. The Son of Man sometimes revealed to Enoch the fate of the Watchers who had overstepped their bounds. It was a sorrowful revelation, for Enoch saw the fall of those celestial beings as not merely punitive but tragic. They had glimpsed the height of creation and yet had allowed themselves to be seduced by what they observed. Their transgression was proof that vision alone does not guarantee virtue. The justice that followed was precise and unflinching, crafted to sever the influence of their ruin while still accounting for the complexity of their existence. Enoch's accounts showed that even within the cosmic order, accountability reigned supreme. These scenes were textured with sound and with silence. Sometimes the Son of Man's instructions came with the faint susurrus of wind through reeds, and at other times they arrived like an unmovable silence that pressed the heart to attention. Enoch noticed that the most transformative moments were rarely accompanied by fireworks, but rather by an internal rearrangement in which the listener's priorities shifted. He sought to teach that presence was more important than spectacle, and that the inner ordering of the soul mattered as much as outward conformity. As Enoch's reputation grew, so did the complexity of his interactions. Rulers sought his counsel, priests debated his claims, and ordinary people sought consolation for their fears. Enoch maintained a measured distance, not of arrogance but of prudence, because he had to guard the integrity of the message. He refused to be co-opted by any political faction, insisting that his loyalty was to the vision and to the movement of justice it outlined. That refusal brought enemies, and at times he faced threats, yet he endured because the Son of Man's presence had taught him steadiness. In private, Enoch wrestled with the impossibility of conveying the fullness of vision in languages made for ordinary life. He composed his words like someone translating a vast landscape into a miniature painting, trying to keep the proportions intact. He experimented with parable and with plain speech, aware that different ears required different cadences. When he sat with those who were willing to listen, he used images drawn from daily tasks, comparing moral truths to farming, to weaving, to the raising of children, so that people could relate what he said to the rhythm of their own hands. The Son of Man's role in Enoch's visions also included the appointment of roles among humankind. Enoch was shown men and women as stewards of particular spheres, each entrusted with care that reflected divine intention. Some were called to lead communities with mercy, some to teach with humility, and some to tend the earth itself with reverence. This ordination implied that every human calling had dignity and an ethical horizon, and Enoch's message valorized ordinary vocations as sacred work. He taught that the holiness of life is often found in the steady performance of small duties carried out with love. One memorable vision depicted a city preparing for a storm, and Enoch watched as its inhabitants divided their labor and their care. Some fortified walls, others gathered seed, and some prepared ways to aid the weak. The Son of Man observed the preparations and then smiled at the diligence of such people, because their actions embodied a knowledge that rescue involves collective responsibility. Enoch used that image to show how communities might avert disaster by practicing foresight and mutual aid, translating cosmic counsel into municipal ethics. The more Enoch saw, the more nuanced his understanding of fate became. He learned not to think in absolutes of doom or salvation, but to regard many outcomes as contingent upon human response. The Son of Man taught him that divine knowledge does not doom the human will but rather invites it into participation. This theological openness became a constant theme in Enoch's preaching, that people were not mere puppets of destiny but co-authors with God in shaping history. Such a posture dignified human responsibility and insisted that repentance and reform could always produce different futures. Enoch also encountered despair among those he tried to help, people who had been ground down by injustice and who could not imagine any deliverance. To them he brought images of endurance and of small, steady lights that would not be snuffed by time. The Son of Man counseled patience as an active force, not a passive waiting, and Enoch relayed this teaching as encouragement to persevere in goodness even when immediate results were absent. He taught that faithfulness in the overlooked corners of life could shift the axis of a community given enough fidelity over time. As he grew older, Enoch's body bore the marks of a life lived on the margins of comfort, hands calloused by work, eyes steady with wakefulness, and a cadence of speech matured by sorrow. Yet his inner light did not dim, instead, it matured, as old wine refines its flavor. The Son of Man's visits continued, sometimes more intimate, sometimes giving broader vistas of eras yet to come. Enoch realized that part of his charge was to ensure that his accounts would be available to those beyond his lifetime, to plant words like seeds that could germinate in distant generations. Among Enoch's most profound revelations was the idea of the Son of Man as both judge and advocate, a figure who embodied the paradox of severity and mercy. At times the Son of Man's judgments were presented as courtroom decrees, and at other moments they emerged as sacrificial acts of solidarity with the suffering. Enoch understood that true leadership does not simply rule from a distance but enters into the plight of the afflicted, bearing some of their burdens. This duality reshaped how Enoch spoke of authority, insisting that legitimate power always included a preference for the least among the people. Enoch's writings took on a literary quality born of the necessity to hold complexity in balanced phrases. He used metaphors of ships and harbors, of gardens and plagues, to capture the moral realities of his time. The Son of Man's images often complemented his own, and the pair of them created a vocabulary that could speak across differences of language. Enoch's narrative style aimed at clarity more than at ornament, for he knew that those in peril needed directions they could follow, not riddles to puzzle over. The prophet also described seeing the Son of Man seated upon a throne like a mountain of light, but unlike earthly thrones, this seat was not isolated glory but a place from which care radiated. From there the Son of Man radiated laws that were not mere commands but invitations into a pattern of life that healed. Enoch was told that those who sat upon such a mountain had to be willing to descend into valleys where people struggled, to be accessible and not aloof. This image taught Enoch that leadership's legitimacy hinges on presence among the needy and a patience for the slow work of mending. In another vision, Enoch saw the cosmic balance as alone, threads of history interlaced by intention and chance. The Son of Man guided the shuttle, not by dominating every string but by weaving in patterns that allowed human agency to show. Enoch's metaphor underscored that the divine does not necessarily obliterate freedom in the pursuit of order. Rather, it works through freedom to bring about an ordered beauty. This idea offered those who feared determinism a way to see their choices as meaningful and consequential. There were scenes of lament, too, where Enoch walked through places filled with tears and woke consciences. He watched communities mourning their lost instincts for kindness and saw the pain of leaders who had chosen self-interest. The Son of Man stood among the mourners, not as a distant judge but as a companion who shared their sorrow and who offered a path forward. Enoch learned that mourning can be a sacred discipline when it fosters repentance and a renewed desire for justice. Enoch's role as scribe led him to codify many things for those who would follow him. He penned warnings and promises, ordinances and counsel, and he attempted to preserve what he feared might be swept away in the coming flood. His writings were practical in tone and infused with the urgency of someone tending a lighthouse when a storm approaches. He labored over the words as if each one could shore up the moral shoreline against a rising tide. His messages to rulers were direct. He told kings that their crowns meant responsibility and that wealth gathered at the expense of the weak would not stand in the final accounting. He exhorted judges to pursue justice for the orphan and the widow as if their judgments were the hinge upon which society turned. These admonitions were not political rhetoric but moral imperatives drawn from visions of a world that had to be tended with care if it were to survive. Enoch also attended to the spiritual formation of the young, counseling those who might become future leaders to take humility seriously. He argued that character could be crafted by the disciplines of restraint, service, and prayer, and he modeled these disciplines in his daily life. The Son of Man's presence reinforced this teaching by honoring those who had chosen service over prestige, and Enoch used those examples to motivate emerging generations. Throughout his years of revelation, Enoch wrestled with the paradox of revealing future calamity while wanting to prevent it. He learned that telling the future was not a neutral act and that prophecy could catalyze the very responses it predicted. Thus he became strategic, sometimes holding back certain details to prevent despair, and at other times disclosing plainly to stir necessary change. He discovered that timing in speech could be as crucial as the content, and that wise prophetic utterance considered the capacity of listeners to bear truth. There were also moments of humor in Enoch's life, quiet mercies that kept his spirit buoyant. He laughed at the stubbornness of a stubborn goat, at a child's unexpected wit, and at the human propensity to invent excuses. Those small joys sustained him, reminding Enoch that the life of a seer need not be solemnity alone. The Son of Man's messages did not strip the world of delight. Rather, they sought to restore joy where it had been corrupted by greed and cruelty. Enoch's description of the cosmic geography included thresholds and gates that regulated the movement of light and shadow, and he watched as the Son of Man opened and closed them according to a moral logic. These openings were not arbitrary but corresponded to the degree of receptivity among human hearts. When hearts turned toward justice, the gates widened and grace streamed in. When hearts hardened, the gates narrowed and judgment followed. This image offered a simple but potent theology. Human orientation influences the atmosphere of a community. As the day of the flood drew near, Enoch's prophecies took on an even greater urgency. He increased his travels, visiting villages and cities, pressing into marketplaces, and standing beneath the porticos of rulers to remind them of the imminent reckoning. He begged people not merely to reform outwardly but to cultivate inward renewal, because external observances without internal transformation would not suffice. Some heeded him and worked to change from the inside out, while others sealed their hearts against the warnings. Enoch also reported esoteric elements of the vision, such as celestial tablets where destinies were traced, and secret chambers where knowledge of ages past was kept. These images fascinated later readers, but Enoch treated them as functionary details, mechanisms that made sense of how memory and consequence were preserved across time. The Son of Man used these chambers not for hoarded knowledge, but to remind Enoch that memory matters, that forgetting can be a moral failing, and that accountancy in the universe is precise. At supreme moments, Enoch was allowed to behold the intention behind the creation, a longing for communion between the Maker and the made, and a desire that justice and mercy be married in the governance of the world. The Son of Man embodied that intention, acting as both guarantor and mediator of a design that sought mutual flourishing. Enoch's understanding of existence matured as he grasped that the cosmos was not an absurd accident but a crafted environment with moral aims. This was not an abstract philosophical claim but a motivational force for earnest living. In the hours before the flood, Enoch felt both grief and an odd serenity, like someone witnessing the necessary clearing of a wound to allow healing. He intensified his writings, compiling exhortations and consolations, and he made sure that tapestries of counsel were stored where they might be found after the waters receded. He urged people to save not just their food but their relational commitments, so that rebuilding would not mean starting over in the ways that created the disaster. His final messages before the deluge were both practical and spiritual, a manual for surviving morally as well as physically. Throughout the deluge itself, Enoch's visions showed that the Son of Man walked the valleys between the waves, a presence informing the blankness with a promise of ordering. The waters did their work of erasure, but in Enoch's perception there was an undercurrent of renewal, as if the flood prepared a soil that could receive a different kind of seed. Enoch's faith was not vindictive in the face of judgment. Instead, he trusted that the painful clearing would permit a new chapter in which righteousness had a firmer root. He watched in prayer and in sorrow as the old structures gave way. When the waters eventually receded and the world emerged as if cleansed, Enoch's narrative shifted toward restoration and toward the shaping of new covenants. The Son of Man's role transformed in these visions from one of judicial oversight to one who negotiated the terms of renewal. Enoch witnessed the ways communities gathered the ruins and began to build again with a renewed sense of responsibility. He recorded the beginnings of a social ethic rebuilt on mercy, humility, and a commitment to protect the weak. After the flood, Enoch continued to be a voice for tempered governance and ethical living, teaching that catastrophe had not been an end but a painful rebirth. His stories of the Son of Man lingered in the ears of those who would listen, providing both a warning against hubris and a model for compassionate authority. He became a repository of lessons learned through suffering, and his counsel informed practices of justice for generations. Enoch's experience raises enduring questions about prophecy and the moral life: how to hear warnings without despair, how to enact justice without cruelty, and how to integrate divine vision into daily action. He modeled a way of attention that combined courage with tenderness and that understood the long reach of small decisions. His vision of the Son of Man served as both standard and consolation, a figure who balances judgment with mercy and who invites humanity into a partnership for restoration. As listeners follow his path, they are invited to consider their own seasons of calling, the small acts of faithfulness that will shape communities, and the ways they might steward knowledge and power. Enoch's life suggests that being chosen to speak truth is not a privilege without responsibility, but a charge that demands humility, endurance, and compassion. The Son of Man's image remains for us a compass, pointing toward an ethic in which justice heals and mercy redeems. In the long thread of human history, Enoch's visions remain a potent reminder that the heavens are not indifferent and that the moral contour of life matters deeply. His narrative encourages a moral imagination large enough to include cosmic concerns and small enough to attend to a neighbor's need. He shows that prophecy is not the monopoly of an elite but a function of a life tuned to listening, and that every person may, through steady acts of love, become a repository of renewal. Even now, the echoes of his witness invite reflection, of the need for leaders who serve rather than dominate, of communities that guard the vulnerable, and of technologies that are tempered by ethics. Enoch's story presses us to contemplate not merely the future but the way present actions will sound there, and it asks whether we will choose to braid mercy into our structures. The Son of Man stands as an emblem of that braided virtue, a reminder that authority finds its highest expression in the protection of the least. The call of Enoch was never just a historical curiosity, it was an educational crucible in which the themes of justice, mercy, responsibility, and restoration were forged. His life teaches that visions can be lived into being, that prophetic seeing requires practical doing, and that the tension between judgment and love is the engine of moral transformation. Enoch's example is both a challenge and an invitation to live with attention, to speak with courage, and to work with steadiness for a future that honors the dignity of all. As a final thought in this unfolding tale, we can imagine the Son of Man continuing to travel the margins between heaven and earth, calling those willing to hear into a life of principled action. Enoch stands as a companion on that journey, his voice echoing across ages, and his call remains current: be attentive, be just, be merciful, and do your small part to steward the world God entrusted to human care. The richness of his vision compels us not to be passive, but to become artisans of repair in a world always vulnerable to decay but always capable of renewal. I remember the night Enoch first found the path to the heavens as if I were there beside him, walking in the hush before dawn when the air held its breath. He did not stride into light like a conqueror, he rose gently as if lifted by a memory, each step a soft loosening from the world's gravity. The sky above him was not simply sky but a layered sound, a sequence of quiet notes waiting for the ear that could hear them in stillness. In that hush, the journey began, not with thunder but with a clarity that settled like a promise. He moved because something older than his name had called. The ascent did not begin at the first cloud line, it began in a shrinking of ordinary things, where the familiar edges of houses and trees folded inward and the map of his own life rearranged itself. Streets became stories, and stories opened into corridors of light that led beyond memory into revelation. He felt the tug of unseen hands, not unkind but purposeful, guiding him through thresholds that had no doors. Every step dissolved a small certainty and replaced it with a sight that asked him to trust differently. By the time he reached the first heaven, he had already left the comfortable geometry of his past behind. The first heaven was like the soft earliest morning, a place of dew and whisper where angels passed like gardeners tending vast gardens of sound. Here the air tasted of beginning, as if the act of creation could still be smelled like rain on parched earth. Enoch listened to names being spoken, names that felt like seeds. When spoken, they unfurled into light and small, bright life. It was a realm of nascent things, where every movement made a new possibility. He lingered long enough to feel remembrance at the edges of his bones. Beyond that lay the second heaven, a domain of rivers and measures, where cosmic waters flowed in ways that made sense to a soul learning to read the architecture of worlds. The waters were not merely wetness, they were histories and currents of fate, each eddy carrying the stories of people long forgotten on earth. Enoch watched as angels tended these streams like librarians, opening scrolls held in light and letting their words dissolve into the flow. The sound here was deeper, a low chant that steadied him like a pulse. It taught him the patient rhythm of time measured not by clocks but by purpose. As he rose, the heavens expanded not outward so much as inward, revealing layers where light changed its grammar and truth spoke in different dialects. Colors were currency and scent was memory, and every sense had to be retrained, gentle as a child's hand learning to write. He crossed thresholds marked by simple things, a particular scent of resin, the taste of iron, a single chord held until it resolved. And in each passage he gained a new perspective that remade how he understood the one below him. The journey was not linear, it spiraled, circling back to themes like mercy and accountability, each return clarifying a deeper meaning. Enoch began to suspect that the heavens were less a destination than a great conversation he had been invited to join. In the third heaven, the lights arranged themselves into law and order, like constellations that were also statutes, and Enoch saw archives suspended like lanterns. Here the angels moved with precise economy, carrying records and tallying names, not with cold detachment but with reverence for the tiny gravity of each life. The air tasted of ink and metal, and when a record was opened it sang, the syllables of a human life blooming into audible history. Enoch watched an angel open a ledger and felt the tenderness in how each name was handled. He realized that accountability was not an instrument of punishment alone, it was also the careful keeping of what had been entrusted. The fourth heaven clothed itself in fire and brilliance, a brilliance that was not blinding but clarifying, like striking a lantern and seeing the room anew. Here the fabric of justice was woven, threads of judgment and repair braided together into a pattern that made sense only to the eye that could stand within it. Enoch felt the heat and was not burned. Instead, he found clarity as if fog had been lifted from an old wound. The angels here were less like servants and more like craftsmen, shaping destinies with hands that had learned both hardness and mercy. He understood that some truths demand intensity before they can be held. Beyond that, the fifth heaven opened into something akin to chambers of music, where voices rose and fell in patterns that reformatted the heart. Choruses that did not sing simply to praise, they encoded stories, each note a sentence, each cadence a moral. Enoch found himself understanding the world through melody, realizing that forgiveness could sound like a minor chord resolving into major, that grief had its own harmonies. He stood at the edge of those choirs and felt his chest expand to accommodate more grief and more joy than he had thought possible together. The sound taught him to listen differently to the world beneath his feet. The sixth heaven felt like a tribunal and a sanctuary at once, where the Son of Man first took familiar shape in Enoch's sight, not as a distant concept but as an intimate presence with eyes like wells of knowledge. The Son of Man was not immediately enthroned in thunder here, rather, he sat with a composure that made justice resemble hospitality. Enoch approached with the reverence of one who enters both a courtroom and a home, because here verdicts were delivered with the care of a parent choosing language for a child. The Son of Man's words wrapped around sorrow and joy at once, speaking in sentences that left space for repentance. Enoch found himself both humbled and held. In the glow of that presence, Enoch saw the interplay between mercy and sovereignty unspool like a tapestry revealing both pattern and hand. The Son of Man did not erase wrongs lightly. Instead, he folded them into a broader story that did not deny consequence but sought restoration. Enoch watched how names were not only listed but also understood, how histories were not merely recounted but recontextualized. He saw that anger could be fierce and righteous, and that it could also be channeled toward repair rather than destruction. The sight reshaped his own sense of judgment and longing for fairness. As Enoch climbed higher, the heavens revealed councils where angelic beings deliberated with the seriousness of magistrates and the tenderness of stewards. They debated futures as one might debate the care of a child, weighing the impact of each decree with the patience of lovers of life. Here the Son of Man appeared not only as arbiter but as advocate, making room in the council for voices that otherwise might not be heard. Enoch learned the art of listening to both complaint and plea, of understanding that the highest wisdom often considers the weakest plea. The councils taught him the politics of compassion. There were libraries that hung in suspension like fruit in an orchard, each book a constellation, and Enoch wandered among them as one roaming a bibliophile's dream. The books were not bound in leather but in living light, their pages breathing as if the words were animals stirring beneath skin. When he touched one, a memory would unfold, a life narrative flashing in colors he had no names for until the book translated itself to his heart. Some books were small and precise, containing the measure of a single human day's kindness. Others were vast and turbulent, full of wars and weather and the slow erosion of civilizations. He learned the humility of knowing that each life, however ordinary, was recorded with the care of a sacred text. Some stories are written in books of light, others in the days we live. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what you feel more, the wonder of Enoch's discovery or the quiet truth that your own life might already be a page in that same book. In a chamber hung with mirrors, Enoch saw reflections that were not his face but choices made and unmade, the branches of decisions that had split into separate worlds. Each mirror showed a different tendency of his heart, and when he looked he was not only observer but participant, seeing how small acts of mercy had sent ripples outward. The mirrors did not shame him, they taught him the architecture of consequence. He realized that even the smallest act of kindness could refract into light enough to change a life across generations. That knowledge steadied him like a hand on the shoulder. There was a place where the Watchers kept their counsel, a domain that carried the weight of promise and warning both, for these were the angels who had looked closely at the human world and sometimes lost their way. Enoch listened as the Watchers spoke of longing and the peril of unguarded affection, their voices threaded with regret and revelation. The memory of rebellion did not paint them as monsters but as beings entrapped by beauty, demonstrating the fragile line between wonder and trespass. Enoch felt no glee in their shame. Instead, he felt a deep empathy for creatures capable of mistake. He learned that redemption often begins with honest naming of error. The ascent then led him to a hall where heavenly geometry was taught, where forms and ratios explained why a comet arcs as it does and why a child's laughter changes the tilt of a village night. Angels there were mathematicians and poets, working side by side, for in the heavens logic and lyric were siblings. Enoch sat with them, learning how order and beauty interwove to sustain reality, how symmetry was not sterile but infused with compassion. He marveled at an equation that read like a prayer, a formula whose balance preserved tiny ecosystems of mercy. Understanding here did not make him proud, it made him careful. At one threshold, Enoch met creatures of such strangeness that his tongue recoiled trying to name them, and yet each creature's intent was simple and human, to serve the life they had been given. Wings of impossible colors folded with the courtesy of an old friend, eyes that contained galaxies blinked with a humor he recognized as wise. They guided him through corridors where the air was thick with the scent of citrus and thunder, where storms were stored like storerooms of energy to be used when a world needed waking. These beings taught Enoch that service could be playful, that the labor of stewardship need not be grim. Their laughter folded into the journey, making gravity feel lighter. He passed through a region of metallic sheen where the machinery of fate hummed, not coldly but with a warmth like an industrious heart, and he saw wheels within wheels that did not grind but tuned. Each turning was intentional, calibrated to balance mercy with consequence, to answer to a logic that honored creation's dignity. Enoch watched operators of invisible levers move with reverence, for even mechanism had soul when it was designed to uphold life. The complexity did not discourage him, it deepened his awe at how meticulous the care of worlds could be. He began to understand the patience involved in governing the sweep of history. In a quieter sphere, he encountered scenes of reconciliation played out like quiet dramas, where strange things were braided back together through patient work. Lovers were restored, old debts were quietly settled with acts of surprising humility, and families rebuilt themselves around whispered apologies. Enoch witnessed how repentance and repair could be slow and unglamorous, and yet more powerful than any sudden miracle. He felt the weight of returning to those we had hurt, and how bravery sometimes looked like a softened voice. The sphere taught him that restoration required time and courage. There was a garden in the heavens that looked like an echo of Eden but deeper, where trees bore not only fruit but memory and possibility, and each leaf was a lesson in patience. Enoch wandered between trunks whose roots threaded into the fabric of creation, drinking the light that filtered as if through stained glass of morality. Fruits of comprehension grew there, and when he tasted them he remembered things he had not known he had forgotten. The garden's hush was not silence but concentration, and Enoch felt baptized in the slow rhythms of growth. He learned that innocence and knowledge could coexist, each deepening the other. One night, and the very phrasing misleads because night here was not the night of earth but a relative pause in heavenly brightness, he found himself invited to a banquet where faces of many peoples gathered, not to feast on food but on understanding. Conversations flowed like wine, generous and intoxicating, but never stupefying, for clarity was the aim. Stories were exchanged with an open tenderness, the sort that dissolves the sting of anger without erasing the lesson. Enoch drank from cups of memory and left fuller not with indulgence but with resolve. The banquet reminded him that communal wisdom is forged in the sharing of pain and delight. In a room lined with windows, he watched the Son of Man interact with the histories of nations, speaking softly to the trajectories of empires as if to coax them away from ruin. The Son did not wield power like a hammer but like a gardener pruning a tree for fuller fruit, an intimate tending that refused cruelty. Enoch felt the subtlety of this governance, a nudge here, a withheld wind there, interventions that preserved freedom while steering toward flourishing. He watched how mercy could be both gentle and strategic, an artistry of restraint. Witnessing this, Enoch's own ideas of leadership altered into something less domineering and more circumspect. The seventh heaven, which some had spoken of in hushed rumor and others in ballad, stretched out like an ocean of light where the Son of Man's presence became central and undeniable. Here the throne was not an isolated seat but a hub of relationships, the focal point of care radiating outward. Enoch approached and felt the pulse of something both regal and intimately humble, a sovereignty that did not crush but embraced. Around the throne clustered beings of every manner, their faces lit by recognition and a deep, tender respect. The scene was too vast to compress into a single emotion. It was like standing before a sunrise while someone you loved took your hand. In that place, the Son of Man spoke to Enoch with words that were simple yet held the weight of eternity. They did not command so much as reveal what always had been true. He spoke of human frailty in a voice that sounded like a lullaby and a verdict at once, and Enoch felt the complexity of being both beloved and accountable. The Son's speech was like a river cutting through rock, slow and unstoppable and, in its persistence, profoundly shaping. Each phrase invited Enoch to see his life ethically, not as a series of isolated acts but as a trajectory living into meaning. The language of the throne sifted his ambitions down to their essence. Enoch was shown visions of cities, not as grand displays but as networks of small mercies, where an old woman with a lamp could change a neighborhood by simply being steady. He learned that the greatest revolutions were often local revolutions of care, modest acts that accumulate into a transformation of soil. The Son of Man emphasized that power gets exercised not only in grand proclamations but in the patient tending of relationships that keep communities alive. Enoch saw how policy and prayer intertwined, and how each could be an expression of love when rightly ordered. He began to map justice as a practice lived at the kitchen table as much as on any throne. There were moments when Enoch's ascent carried him into starker courts of judgment, spaces that felt colder only because they were precise, where wrongs were weighed and the ripple effects of choices were laid bare. These scenes did not delight him, they educated him. He saw punishments administered not as revenge but as forms of instruction meant to rehabilitate what could be mended and to separate what would only spread harm if left unchecked. He found himself torn between grief and recognition, understanding that to care for a multitude sometimes requires making hard distinctions. The experience tempered his instincts toward mercy with an appreciation for the necessity of protection. In a luminous chamber, he watched the Son of Man receive petitions from creation itself, voices rising not with ploys but with honest needs, thirsts that belonged to rivers and hungers that belonged to cities. Each petition was heard in detail, and the responses were deliberate, sometimes granting what was asked and sometimes redirecting desire toward something purer. Enoch recognized that the Son was not indifferent to want, but loved the world enough to provide for what it truly needed rather than what it merely wished for. That discernment struck Enoch as supremely compassionate, an intelligence guided by love rather than mere indulgence. He began to understand the architecture of providence as a mixture of tenderness and wisdom. During one segment of his journey, the heavens showed Enoch scenes of history as living tapestries, threads woven by choices both grand and small, and he saw how the Son of Man sometimes embroidered in ways that made right what it frayed. These corrections were patient craftsmanship, not magic erasure, and they required time. Enoch watched healings that looked more like slow mending than sudden miracles, and he felt the relief of a tapestry being restored to use rather than kept pristine behind glass. The Son's interventions revealed a theology that favored restoration over annihilation. Enoch learned to admire restraint as a form of courage rather than weakness. He encountered angels whose task was to guard thresholds, beings who stood watch over beginnings and endings with a wary, loving attention. They were neither grim nor gleeful, they were vigilant, and their vigilance taught Enoch the value of boundaries. Here he learned that sanctions and gates were not the opposite of affection but its necessary expression, that love sometimes requires a strong no for the preservation of flourishing. The watchers' faces were marked by a tenderness honed into firmness, a balance Enoch found holy. They taught him stewardship looks like both welcome and protection. At another point, the journey took him into a vault of silence where the Son of Man's voice was not required because presence itself was speech enough. Silence there was not emptiness but a full chambering of attention, a listening so acute that the smallest motion registered like a bell. Enoch understood that not all answers are spoken aloud, and that some truths are planted in the marrow of one who learns to be silent. He tasted the discipline of patience, discovering that stillness could be an active engagement with the world rather than mere absence. This lesson settled like cool water. There were scenes of cosmic repair where the Son of Man directed a soft, insistent work to right distortions that had crept into creation, like a gardener pruning an invasive vine from the trunk of a sacred tree. The work was neither vengeful nor indifferent. It was precise, aimed at restoring balance so that all creatures could find their proper place again. Enoch marveled at how surgical yet compassionate the corrections were, how they honored both the suffering and the need for restoration. He saw that healing can involve loss and that loss sometimes serves a larger flourishing. That truth was hard but necessary. Sometimes the Son of Man allowed Enoch to witness future scenes unfurling like training wheels falling away from the motion of reality, and these glimpses were both terrifying and hopeful. He saw cities rebuilt by hands that had once wanted to destroy them, heard songs sung by children of people who had been enemies, and watched stubborn injustices give way to communal care. The future was not tidy. It bore the scars of contest and repair, and yet it moved toward a horizon of surprising beauty. Enoch learned that hope in the heavens was realistic, forged not by ignoring suffering but by attending to it with unwavering labor. The son's approach to the future was persistent optimism, an optimism that worked. On one threshold he encountered a valley of names, a quiet registry where each human identity was honored and spoken back into dignity, especially those erased or overlooked by history. The Son of Man walked among these names with deliberateness, pausing to speak a recognition that reanimated dignity. Enoch felt the power held in being known, a recognition that left him trembling with gratitude and responsibility. He understood then why God in many forms chooses names as the first act of relationship, how naming is a way to anchor someone in the story of creation. The valley taught him to value identity as a sacred trust. There were dialogues with saints and prophets who had gone before, voices that threaded advice into Enoch's ears like a loving curriculum, practical and visionary at once. They spoke of patience, courage, and the peculiar courage of those who remain available for long seasons without immediate reward. Enoch listened to their counsel as if receiving maps stitched with both warnings and invitations, routes through deserts and orchards alike. The Son of Man sometimes sat in these conversations, adding gentle corrections and confirmations, shaping a lineage of wisdom that felt like a family. Enoch absorbed their patience and learned endurance. At times he felt the strain of sorrow as if it were a physical weight pressing into his lungs, for the heavens did not shelter him from grief, rather, they widened his capacity to bear it. He watched slaughtered innocents stand with the dignity of those who had known their worth, and he felt the unjustly silenced breathe words like testimony. These images broke him and rebuilt him, forging in him a grief that turns toward action rather than despair. The Son of Man did not remove the pain but taught him how to hold it and shape it into advocacy. Grief became a ministry rather than a prison. In quieter hours, Enoch observed celebrations of ordinary goodness elevated to holy rites, parents gently teaching a child, neighbors sharing bread, long-standing partnerships that had weathered storms being renewed. The Son of Man celebrated these things not as small trivia but as the building blocks of a moral cosmos, catalysts of social healing. Enoch learned that holiness often hides in the unremarkable, like gold in common rock, and that attention to these moments mattered. The heavens seemed to glow most for the faithful acts that required patience and low-level heroism. He felt his heart expand to recognize sanctity in the mundane. There were times when the Son of Man engaged Enoch in questions rather than answers, an exchange designed to stir thought and responsibility rather than to provide final solutions. These dialogic moments felt like apprenticeship, with the Son asking what the world needed and Enoch responding with nascent wisdom. The process taught him a humility rooted in agency, that being called to discernment is both gift and obligation. He walked away from those conversations altered, less certain of simple answers and more committed to the labor of seeking justice. The Son's method modeled collaborative wisdom as a spiritual discipline. Enoch was shown strange theologies made tangible, doctrines turned into scenes he could touch, and he felt the relief of abstract ideas becoming living practices. He saw charity in the form of hands passing bread across a table, eschatology as a garden tended with care, and atonement as patient mending of relationships. Each idea became a ritual he could perform, and by performing he learned how belief must translate into action. The Son of Man taught doctrine through enactment, creating a theology that required feet to walk and hands to help. Enoch learned faith as a verb. There were audiences where the Son of Man welcomed petitioners who came with both sin and song, people whose lives were messy and miraculous in equal measure. He loved them openly and corrected them candidly, a presence that did not condone harm yet refused to discard hope. Enoch observed the way shame was unmade by steady gaze and steady work, how confession could be the first act of freedom when met with accountability and guidance. The atmosphere in those audiences was electric with possibility, for repentance and repair were treated as communal projects. Enoch carried from them a fierce confidence in the transformative power of honest return. As the voyage continued, Enoch found himself in a hall of stars where the Son of Man showed him how each light connected to particular prayers and acts of fidelity on earth, an elegant economy of attention. The stars were not indifferent lights but beacons of stories, each initiated by a life that had chosen compassion over convenience. Enoch touched a star and felt a memory of someone who had stayed up to hold another's hand during a long night, a small fidelity that shone eternally. He realized that such constellations were less about fame and more about faithfulness. The heavenly map impressed upon him that small loyalties have cosmic significance. There was a chamber where time was taught like a language, and Enoch sat as a student learning verbs of patience and tenses of hope. Time here was elastic and moral, stretching to include endurance and contracting to emphasize urgency when lives were at stake. The Son of Man explained the ethics of timing, when mercy must be immediate and when it requires careful cultivation. Enoch learned to read seasons, to distinguish between a moment calling for swift intervention and a year asking for steadfast presence. He left with a new calendar in his bones. The heavens taught Enoch about covenant in vivid, dramatic ways, showing contracts forged not with ink but with blood and breath, promises breathed between creator and created. These covenants were binding not because of legal enforcement but because they encoded mutual obligations that sustained life. The Son of Man walked him through covenant scenes where promises were renewed with food and song, where compacts were sealed by the exchange of bread and labor. Enoch understood that fidelity to promise was the backbone of thriving communities. This lesson shaped his understanding of trust as practical, lived reliability. He witnessed ministries of forgiveness enacted as social architecture, communities built with spaces explicitly designed for apology and repair, where restitution procedures were as normal as markets and schools. The Son of Man showed that when a society makes room for repair, it becomes more resilient and honest. Enoch saw restitution practiced in ways both symbolic and practical, people returning what had been taken and doing the toil required to earn back trust. He observed that repair is often humbling labor, and that humble labor can be joyful when it restores bonds. The heavens were pragmatic about justice. The journey contained unexpected humor, angelic laughter that was not mocking but freeing, a reminder that joy is an essential function of the cosmos. The Son of Man himself smiled often, not as a frivolous indulgence but as an indicator that delight is a means of resisting despair. Enoch observed how laughter loosened rigid ideas and allowed new perspectives to form. Humor became a valve releasing pressure, a necessary counterbalance to sorrow. He learned that sacred life includes delight as much as duty. In a vast hall of rings, he learned about the social web of creation, how beings and nations influence one another with the subtlety of orbiting bodies. Influence, here, was not coercion but gravitational interplay. Some lives tugged gently and rearranged the course of others over time. The Son of Man explained how moral influence is earned, not taken, and how reputation must be guarded by consistent habit rather than clever rhetoric. Enoch saw that leadership is an accrued trust and that the cosmos respects those who steward influence well. The lesson felt like a charge to wield power with care. There were moments when Enoch felt fear, real, sharp, necessary, for the heavens did not sanitize the danger that attends moral choice. The Son of Man did not flinch from the hard realities, and sometimes he allowed the weight of consequence to press upon Enoch so the man would grasp the stakes of his life. Yet even fear was taught with a hand that steadied, ensuring it did not shrink the heart into paralysis. The lesson was practical. Fear can sharpen moral vision if it is acknowledged and navigated, not denied. Enoch learned courage as a companion to fear rather than its absence. He was shown scenes of ordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness side by side, a juxtaposition that prevented easy absolution of sin and insisted on active participation in healing. The Son of Man's work seemed to thread mercy through the needle's eye of reality, stitching up the torn cloth with both firmness and gentleness. Enoch saw that some cruelties require structural change rather than mere individual remorse, and he watched strategies being devised in heavenly councils for such long-term work. He learned that compassion must sometimes be political as well as personal. The heavens were practical about systemic wrongs. There were images of the Son of Man teaching children, demonstrating patience and wonder in ways that made Enoch weep with a humility he had not expected. The teaching was not simply intellectual, it was relational, built through stories and touch. Enoch saw how forming the next generation demands humility and radical availability, a willingness to be less than one once was for the sake of those who are becoming. The Son's pedagogy emphasized embodiment, lessons lived aloud more than lectures given. Enoch felt himself softened into a more childlike posture of learning. At one point Enoch was led to a place where actual languages were kept, the tongues of creatures and epics, and he listened as the Son of Man translated not words alone but the feelings behind them. Translation: there was an act of mercy, bridging alienation and misunderstanding between peoples. Enoch was shown how misinterpretation fuels conflict and how patient interpretation can build peace. He learned that the task of translation is always an ethical act, requiring empathy and fidelity. The heavens trained him to hear beneath the noise. He was presented with visions of suffering that stretched beyond comprehension, famines, wars, seasons of barrenness, yet these visions were never allowed to stand alone, always they were paired with scenes of response. The Son of Man showed interventions large and small, from cosmic restorations to neighbors sharing bread, reminding Enoch that suffering invites a multitude of responses. Enoch learned not to despair at scale but to start where one stood, to understand that each response is a node in a vast network of care. The heavenly pedagogy focused on agency within context. There were moments when the Son of Man asked Enoch to speak on behalf of the people, to carry words down as a messenger, and Enoch felt the holiness and burden of representation. He learned the importance of fidelity to the voice that one carries, ensuring translation without distortion. The Son instructed him on how to bear witness responsibly, training him to speak truth without cruelty and to avoid the seduction of speaking merely to be heard. These lessons became the ethics of prophetic language. Enoch left with a renewed sense of responsibility about the words he would carry down to earth. In a chamber of mirrors, Enoch confronted futures that hinged on small, present choices, and he realized that destiny is often sculpted in the quiet decisions of daily life. The Son of Man did not deny grand destinies but insisted they are built from small fidelities. Enoch was instructed that the divine economy prizes consistency and that remarkable outcomes often arise from ordinary perseverance. He found comfort in the idea that his small acts mattered in the long weave of history. The heavens empowered him with a sense of significance for the mundane. He was also instructed in the ethics of lament, a sacred practice taught in a cathedral of grief where voices were trained to cry with honesty and without cynicism. The Son of Man modeled lament as a legitimate spiritual posture, an avenue not to wallow but to right feeling and align action. Enoch learned that to lament truly is to refuse false consolation and to commit to the labor of addressing pain. Lament became for him a discipline that opened hands to work instead of closing them in denial. The sunshine after lament felt earned rather than cheap. Enoch learned about the balance between destiny and freedom as he watched the Son of Man negotiate cosmic plans that always left room for genuine choice. The heavens refused to be deterministic and honored the messy reality of free will, arranging frameworks that guided rather than coerced. Enoch saw that the sun's governance prized relationship over control and that this required an extraordinary patience. The lesson was that love that binds must be freely chosen, and the heavens crafted conditions that invited such choice. Enoch carried from this a renewed respect for human dignity. There were times Enoch was invited into the sun's solitude, quiet spaces where he meditated on sorrow and hope alike, revealing that even the one who governs must often drink the cup of loneliness. These moments humanized the Son of Man for Enoch, showing vulnerability that did not undermine authority but refined it. Enoch learned compassion for leaders, a recognition that bearing the burdens of others demands a life of disciplined care. The sun's solitude was a model of replenishment, not mere escape. Enoch saw strength woven with humility. Angelic artisans taught him about beauty, not as decoration but as function, how proportion and pattern aid the flourishing of souls and communities. They showed sculptures that healed by their symmetry, melodies that reoriented hearts toward patience, and gardens arranged to remind people of interdependence. Beauty in the heavens served a pedagogical purpose. It formed taste, and taste guides action. Enoch left with the conviction that cultivating beauty in ordinary spaces is an ethical act. The Son of Man's aesthetics became a blueprint for life. He watched the Son of Man enact rituals that knit scattered people together, rites that were not empty tradition but tools for remembering identity and reorienting communal attention. Enoch saw how ritual can be both memory and imagination, a way to recall past faithfulness and envision future care. The Son taught him the value of repetition when it serves to anchor virtue rather than render it rote. Enoch appreciated the wisdom of ritual as a framework that supports moral formation. He learned to respect practices that shape character over time. In a hall of sentinels he watched guardians assigned to nations and cities, their grief for what had been lost matched by fierce resolve to protect what remained. These guardians were not distant bureaucrats, they were close watchers who had learned local histories and tenderly bore neighborly concern. The Son of Man revealed that guardianship is particular and personal, requiring knowledge and a will to endure. Enoch learned to care both for the global and the local, seeing how commingled attentions preserve life. The heavens emphasized embedded compassion. There were visions of reconciliation between peoples who had long been enemies, ceremonies where hands were knotted together in practical pacts of mutual aid, and Enoch felt hope like a bright, stubborn spark. The Son of Man demonstrated how reconciliation never comes cheaply. It requires truth-telling, restoration, and the rebuilding of trust through repeated acts. Enoch watched communities bind themselves with new institutions of mutual accountability, and he recognized the effort it takes to unlearn hatred. The heavens taught him patience for processes that resist quick fixes. This practical hope felt earnest. An arena of petitioners taught him the art of supplication, where requests were refined into honest forms that did not seek mere comfort but true healing. Enoch learned to ask for things that mattered, to shape prayers with clarity and moral imagination. The Son of Man listened and guided prayers into channels of productive action. Enoch discovered that prayer and work are welded together, the one should not displace the other. He left with a new prayerfulness that included hands and feet. In quieter workshops he saw the making of virtues, craftspeople who fashioned patience, courage, and restraint like pottery on a wheel, spinning and trimming until balance emerged. These heavenly artisans did not manufacture virtue as an external object, but cultivated it within the soul's clay by repetitive practice and skill. Enoch observed how discipline produces inner habits that then generate outward acts of goodness. He learned that virtue is less a trophy and more a trained muscle. That metaphor shaped his daily practices on earth. There were debates that ranged from the metaphysical to the mundane, where angels argued the merits of mercy versus strictness with the same rigor a court might debate law. The Son of Man joined these debates not to assert dominance but to model a deliberative spirit, weighing human realities with cosmic perspectives. Enoch saw how argument, when framed by mutual respect and a common aim for flourishing, produced wisdom rather than division. He learned to love the hard work of principled disagreement as long as it remained tethered to the good of the many. The heavens showed him how integrity and charity can coexist in argument. In a garden of inventions, creators experimented with ways to deliver justice and mercy, designing institutions and practices that could be exported to suffering places on earth. Enoch watched proposals modeled in miniature, tested and repaired, and felt the excitement of applied compassion. The Son of Man encouraged innovation when it freed the oppressed and resisted novelty for its own sake. Enoch learned to cherish pragmatic creativity as a spiritual discipline when it sought tangible flourishing. He felt hope about the potential of human ingenuity channeled by conscience. There were private lessons in sorrow wherein the Son of Man revealed his own wounds as part of a larger solidarity with suffering, teaching Enoch that pain shared is pain that invites healing. These disclosures were not displays but invitations to companionate presence. Enoch absorbed the tenderness that comes from being present to another's suffering without trying to solve it immediately. He learned that sometimes accompaniment is the most ethical response. The heavens taught him the ministry of simply being beside another. He saw communities organized around restorative practices, where wrongs were met with dialogues and reparations, and offenders were given opportunities to make amends instead of being cast out. The Son of Man modeled systems that prioritized restoration when possible and protection when necessary. Enoch observed that transformation often required both accountability and resources for change, not either/or. He left with a sense that justice, to be just, must be practical and generous. The heavens modeled repair as a public good. There were corridors lined with portraits of unsung heroes, midwives, caregivers, teachers, their images honored and maintained, testifying that the heavens remember faithful labor even when earth forgets. The Son of Man paused at each portrait with the reverence of one who knows the cost of such dedication. Enoch felt recognized in the small faithful acts of his own life and understood their lasting value. He learned that celestial attention often fixes on the humble, elevating endurance over spectacle. This recognition settled into his bones like validation. In a bright archive he found records not only of sin but of repentance, the exact turns of heart that had altered courses, and the Son of Man tracked these like entries of treasure. He saw the arithmetic of change, how small consistent acts stack into lasting transformation. Enoch felt encouraged by the realism of heaven's bookkeeping. It did not mince the difficulty of moral effort, but it prized steady improvement. The Son's valuation of repentance as progress rather than perfection instilled patience. Enoch learned that persistence becomes holiness. There were night vigils where the Son of Man kept watch with beings who never slept for reasons of holiness but for reasons of love, standing vigil over those in pain. The hush of those watches taught Enoch the power of wakeful presence, bearing witness without obligation to act immediately. He understood the dignity of being held in prayer, of being seen by eyes that did not flinch. The heavens taught him that watchfulness is an act of devotion that sustains suffering souls. He learned to keep his own vigils with compassion. In a workshop of compassion, Enoch watched ideas for social repair crafted into tools that could be used on Earth, education programs, communal kitchens, councils for mediation, all simple but replicable. The Son of Man delighted in these practical interventions, encouraging the translation of heavenly wisdom into human practice. Enoch realized that divine insight often aimed at accessible, scalable acts of love rather than inaccessible miracles. He left with blueprints for mercy that could be borrowed by any town. The heavens prized accessibility in their solutions. There were seasons when the Son of Man allowed Enoch to look back at his own life from a vantage that softened the sharp edges of regret and illuminated the faithful seams he had not noticed. These retrospectives were not indulgent nostalgia but sober inventories leading to gratitude and resolve. Enoch saw himself with a compassion that did not excuse negligence but honored survival. From this vantage he understood his call to speak with honesty and tenderness upon returning. The heart of his mission was refined by insight and mercy together. The Son of Man shared with Enoch a vision of a future where justice and joy intertwined, where the needy found nourishment and communities built resilient institutions in place of fragmentation. The vision did not deny struggle but painted a horizon shaped by patient labor and generous imagination. Enoch felt his spirits buoyed, not by escape from reality but by practical hope rooted in the work he had witnessed in the heavens. He knew that the Son's dream required human hands to enact it. The vision galvanized him rather than pacified him. Before Enoch descended, the Son of Man gave him practical instructions to remember the small acts, to teach the faithful, to invent mercy locally, and to hold grief as a motivator, not a sentinel. These commands were not heavy chains but pragmatic tools for a life of witness. Enoch received them as a parcel of duties wrapped in freedom, a mission that honored the soil he would return to rather than abstract ideals. He felt both honored and nervously human, aware of his limitations and the vastness of the task. The final moments of instruction felt like a commissioning rather than a burdensome mandate. He lingered just long enough to be reoriented to ordinary time, feeling gravity not as a punishment but as a welcome, a pull toward community that needed what he had been given. The heavens did not detach him from the world but equipped him to return with renewed eyes. As he descended, the scents and sounds of earth grew familiar in a new way, as if greeting an old friend with fresh gratitude. The Son of Man's last look was steady and encouraging, an affirmation that his work would matter even if small. Enoch carried that look down like a talisman. On the descent, the layers of heaven receded like chapters closing, and with each passage Enoch folded the lessons inward until they sat near his heart like a small, warm jewel. He did not forget the mechanics of courts and councils, nor the delicacies of mercy and justice, rather he learned to hold them lightly enough to act. The journey had expanded his capacity for both sorrow and joy, engraving humility and resolve into his character. He returned not as one who had solved mysteries but as one entrusted with them. The heavens had taught him how to steward what he had seen. Back among his people, the world seemed different and yet the same, a paradox Enoch welcomed because it matched the complexity he had learned. He began to speak in ways that were practical and prophetic, refusing both easy condemnation and cheap consolation. Enoch's stories were meant to awaken laborers of mercy, people willing to do the small, steady work that heals neighborhoods and nations. The Son of Man's commission had given him not only vision but vocational habits. He set about living what he had learned. He taught people to make space for repair, to honor memory and invent new practices of accountability and generosity, and to see mercy as a public act as much as a private one. Some listened with hunger and some with suspicion, but Enoch treated both reactions with the humility of someone who had seen both beauty and folly in the heavens. He did not become a preacher of easy answers, he became a patient trainer of hearts. The Son's image followed him in his demeanor, measured, insistent, and gentle. Over seasons he established small institutions modeled on what he had seen, communal kitchens that fed dignity as well as hunger, councils for mediating conflict that practiced both truth-telling and reconciliation, schools that taught aesthetics as moral formation. They were imperfect and often under-resourced, yet they grew in influence because they were practical and replicated the heavenly logic of accessible grace. Enoch watched neighborhoods transform through steady exercises of care and accountability, and he wept not for despair but for gratitude. The Son's work continued through the hands Enoch taught. His own life was not spared difficulty, for witnessing does not exempt one from the world it observes, and Enoch faced critics and setbacks that tested the habits he had cultivated. Yet the heavenly disciplines, silence, watchfulness, translation of grief into action, preserved him from despair. He found communities to anchor him, people who had learned to keep vigils and to repair wrongs with humility. The Son's instruction proved practical in the small crises of everyday life. Enoch's journey had become a sustained apprenticeship. In the years that followed, Enoch learned to tell his story in ways that were neither sensational nor bland, inviting listeners to imagine practical pathways for mercy rather than seducing them with celestial spectacle. He spoke of councils and kitchens, of the beauty of small fidelity, of the thunderous quiet of heaven's discipline. People found his words accessible because they were measured by service and not merely wonder. His narrative became a manual for ordinary sanctity. The Son's voice echoed in his pedagogy. Even at the end of his days, Enoch continued to emphasize the mutuality of mercy and justice, teaching that one without the other becomes either sentimental or oppressive. He urged that institutions be built to enable repentance, to protect the vulnerable, and to cultivate delight. Communities he nurtured began to develop cultures marked by patient accountability and spontaneous generosity. The Son of Man's influence persisted not as doctrine alone, but as practices imitated by ordinary people. Enoch felt small comfort in watching seeds sprout. There were nights when he returned inward, sitting in the hush remembering the many faces he had met in the heavens, from the Son of Man to the smallest servant, each carrying their own scars and delights. He realized that his ascent had been less a removal from the world than an immersion in a larger responsibility to it. The Son had given him no easy formulas, only a litany of practices, to name, to tend, to repair, to listen, and to act with courage. Enoch carried those practices like a rhythm in his hands and feet. His final charges to his contemporaries were practical and tender: see the dignity in each life, practice repair where possible, and do not mistake quick fixes for real reconciliation. He insisted that the will to persist matters infinitely, that small acts aggregating over time create the heavens on earth. People gathered and argued and tried and failed and tried again, and Enoch watched the slow, ordinary fruit of communal attention. The Son's hope had become contagious in him, and through his students it took root in many places. As his days waned, Enoch found comfort in the idea that the Son of Man's governance kept room for human freedom and human responsibility together, that the divine ordering of the cosmos prayed for human hands to join. He no longer wished for the heavens merely as respite, he wanted them as a training ground for service in the messy human arena. The Son's presence in his life made him bold enough to face failure and tender enough to keep loving. He died not in triumphant detachment but in the middle of a project that continued beyond his final breath. That continuity contained both sorrow and a profound solace. When tellers and teachers retold Enoch's journey, they often focused on the grandeur of the throne and the splendor of the heavens, but Enoch's deeper plea was for the ordinary transformation of lives through small, faithful acts. He hoped people would remember the specifics, the councils that deliberated slowly, the kitchens that fed dignity, the quiet vigils that accompanied grief, and the way the Son of Man treated every petition with both seriousness and love. His message was less a doctrine of escape and more a playbook for coexistence. The Son of Man's character informed Enoch's final testament, love that stands against both cruelty and apathy. In the end, the journey through the heavens had not made Enoch aloof from human suffering but more capable of staying with it, of translating celestial insight into moral kindness. He returned as a mediator between worlds, someone who had been taught not to exclude the messy realities of life, but to enter them with a new grammar of care. The Son of Man's teachings had nested in him like seeds, and though he was no longer present, the practices he taught lived on. Enoch's life became a corridor through which heaven and earth continued to whisper to one another. And so his legend persisted, not as an abstract tale of ascension but as a manual for practical sanctity, a story that invited people to inspect their own lives and invent small, replicable acts of mercy. The heavens, as Enoch had experienced them, were not a tidy escape but a training ground for doing better where one stood. The Son of Man's presence remained the axis around which all actions of genuine restoration rotated. Enoch's journey thus became a slow revolution of hearts and hands that would go on reshaping neighborhoods, institutions, and the quiet corners of ordinary days. There is a hush to the beginning of this story, as though the world leans in to hear the smallest rustle of the first secret. It moves slowly at first, like a lantern being lit in a vast, primeval night, and in that light we meet Enoch, a man who walked with God and who was shown what lies beyond the borders of ordinary sight. He becomes our companion, our guide through corridors of revelation, bearing not only the weight of what he sees but the urgency to record it. Listening closely, you can almost feel the pages turning on their own, a script written in moonlight and carved into memory. The Son of Man appears in these visions not as a distant statue but as a figure of unexpected intimacy, both judge and advocate, a luminous presence who holds the secrets of justice like a palm holds a seed. He is clothed in light and authority, and yet the way he stands is familiar, as if he could take a seat beside you and speak in a voice made of weather and wisdom. In Enoch's revelations, the Son of Man is the axis upon which the heavenly court turns, and his arrival marks a weighing of deeds and an unveiling of hidden things. When he speaks, the world listens because what he reveals changes how things are seen, and what is seen can never be unseen. There is a peculiar hush around the watchers, those angels assigned to watch over the earth who loved the world in a way that would break all the rules. They came down as one might come down to visit a garden, captivated by the beauty and the rawness of human life. Their desire was immediate and indiscriminate. It gathered like a storm and swept into Eden of mortal hearts, bringing gifts that were not meant for hands of clay. Each transgression bore fruit in strange and terrible ways, and Enoch, walking between heaven and earth, was shown the ledger of those deeds. What the Watchers taught was not merely knowledge but an altered course for humanity. They opened the textbooks of heaven and handed over secrets of metallurgy and sorcery, of herbs and the hidden language of the stars. These were lessons that transformed ordinary life into something dangerous, blending the mechanical with the mystical in a way that unbalanced both angels and humans. Enoch watched as society changed under these new arts, and he felt the cold certainty that knowledge without restraint can become a weapon turned inward. Enoch's path through the heavenly spheres reads like a map of the human soul, marked with stations where visions paused and spoke. He is led from the lowest vaults to the places where light is thickest, passing thrones and courts where beings of indescribable order attend. At each gate he learns a law or hears an accusation, as if the cosmos itself were a tribunal laid out to hear witness. The Son of Man sits at the center of this tribunal, not merely judge but interpreter, making sense of what angels and men had done alike. There is a tenderness in Enoch's reports, a feeling that he is almost bewildered by the intimacy of being shown these things. He does not gloat over secret knowledge. He carries it as one carries a child through a crowd, careful and full of urgency. When he speaks of the giants sired by the union of angels and women, he describes their enormous appetites and the way they devoured the works of men as if to erase a civilization. These giants, the Nephilim, are described with a mixture of horror and pity, for they embodied both the grandeur and the ruin of forbidden union. Between Enoch and the Son of Man there is a certain companionship that deepens with every revelation. The Son of Man is not indifferent to the suffering he must adjudicate. There is a compassion in his judgment that reflects a higher reckoning. He knows the names of the watchers and the strings that moved them, and he speaks of each in terms of responsibility rather than simple condemnation. His presence introduces a moral clarity into the cosmic confusion, as if a window opens and sunlight both heals and burns away what is false. What the Watchers prized was not evil in its bare form but influence. They wanted to be known, to alter the trajectory of human affairs, and to set themselves apart by teaching forbidden crafts. Their choices altered the rhythm of the world, seasons were noticed differently, stars were read with new arrogance, and people began to measure power by mastery of hidden arts. Enoch records this shift with a scholar's eye and a prophet's alarm, showing us how small deviations accumulate into storms. The narrative drifts occasionally into lists in the ancient text, but in Enoch's telling each list is a story of its own, a row of dominoes leading to catastrophe. He names tablets, spirits, and utensils as if they were characters in a family drama, each with motives and weaknesses. The Watcher's instructions about forging weapons and crafting cosmetics read as ominous gifts, sweetened tools that would soon cut the giver. Even the mundane becomes meaningful because it carries the mark of transgression. Enoch's voice softens when he describes the moment he exchanges words with the Son of Man. There is a reverence that does not feel pompous but intimate. The Son of Man explains the reasons for decree and the necessity for balance in a way that reassures the listener that justice here is not mere punishment but restoration of order. There is talk of futures that unfurl like scrolls, of epics that will rise and fall, and of the final unmasking of what has been hidden from sight. For Enoch, these are not academic subjects, they are the contours of destiny, and he is charged with communicating them to humanity. It is in the detail of small sights that Enoch's visions become humanly accessible. He tells of the way dawn looks from the seventh heaven, an expanse of glassy color refracted through ranks of watchers. He speaks of the music of constellations and the language of weather, terms that would otherwise be dry become saturated by his ear for sound and light. The Son of Man listens to these observations, nodding as if confirming what Enoch already intuits, that the cosmos is not only mechanic but profoundly expressive. Enoch learns of a series of letters and signatures that document the sins of the Watchers, written in a hand that trembles with both rage and sorrow. These documents are kept in a vault that is neither wholly heavenly nor wholly earthly, a liminal place reflective of the offenders themselves. The Son of Man endorses their reading and reveals their consequences, explaining that revelation itself participates in judgment because to know is to be accountable. Knowledge, in this dialectic, is both burden and balm. The story shifts from legalities to the intimate consequences that ripple through families and towns. Enoch describes how farmers failed because their fields were cursed by new weapons, how midwives found themselves accused of witchcraft because they used remedies learned from angels. Everyday life disintegrates under the strain of newfound power and fear. The Son of Man's role expands here. He becomes the interpreter of social collapse, translating crimes of the spirit into visible suffering so that people might understand cause and effect. There is a repeated image of doors opening and doors closing, a metaphor that Enoch returns to because it mirrors how revelation operates. A door opens and light spills in, showing what had been in shadow. Another door closes and the future's shape becomes fixed. The Son of Man controls many of these thresholds, and his discretion in opening a doorway highlights the gravity of revelation. Enoch is sometimes allowed to peek through and sometimes only to hear the echo of what lies beyond, and this asymmetry keeps him humble. Enoch's narrative also explores the architecture of sin, how one transgression builds upon another until what began as a private desire becomes a public calamity. The Watcher's initial curiosity about human beauty reproduces into legal and spiritual confusion, and Enoch charts each step with a clinician's precision and a poet's sorrow. The Son of Man, witnessing the cascade, frames the crisis as a lesson about boundaries, illustrating how the cosmos itself depends on certain lines being honored. In making these connections, the text functions as both prophecy and ethic. There is an almost forensic pleasure in the way Enoch describes heavenly instruments of measurement, scales and standards used not for commerce but for justice. The Son of Man uses these instruments to weigh intentions and outcomes, revealing how motivation shifts the moral calculus. Enoch is allowed to glimpse the scale's reactions, sometimes balanced, sometimes tipping with a quiet, consequential clatter. These images serve to remind listeners that consequences are not arbitrary but calibrated to the essence of acts. Beyond the mechanism of judgment, Enoch sees the cosmic archives where the names and deeds of all beings are kept, illuminated on tablets of light. This record is not punitive in itself but a testimony, a mirror reflecting how choices imprint on the fabric of creation. The Son of Man acts as archivist and judge, reading names aloud and naming destinies, and in this practice he offers a kind of redemption. To be known truly is to be seen rightly. Enoch's accounts of these archives are rife with tenderness because, in them, identity is affirmed even as destiny is decided. The tales include the utter strangeness of creatures born of angelic knowledge mixed with human flesh. Enoch paints living portraits of hybrid beings whose very existence questions the order of creation. He describes their despair as well as their might, giving them complexity rather than using them as mere monsters. The Son of Man's interaction with these beings is instructive and careful, suggesting that even aberration deserves an accounting that is proportionate and merciful where possible. Enoch's experiences also emphasize the nature of secrecy itself, how secrets can be seductive and corrosive in the same breath. The Watchers, enamored with the allure of forbidden knowledge, are shown turning secrets into status, and status into strife. The Son of Man cautions that secrets have weight, to reveal them carelessly can devastate, yet to hoard them can corrupt. Enoch is placed at the center of this paradox, called to reveal what should be revealed and to conceal what must remain hidden until the right hour. The narrative returns often to the idea of covenant, that there are pacts not only between people but between orders of being. The Watchers violated a covenant when they crossed a boundary meant to preserve relational integrity. Enoch watches as cosmic agreements are renegotiated and as the Son of Man establishes terms that restore balance. This restoration is not simply punitive, it involves reestablishing trust, reordering relationships, and sometimes creating new forms of guardianship to prevent repetition. There is an insistence on names throughout the tale, as if naming is itself an act that stabilizes reality. The Son of Man knows names, and with them, the capacities for both blessing and judgment, and he employs names like keys to open doors that otherwise remain sealed. Enoch learns that to speak a name is to call forth a history, and that names are never neutral. In the quieter parts of the vision, Enoch writes down names as if they might serve as talismans against future forgetting. Enoch experiences seasons within the heavens, a pulse of time that clarifies patterns and punctuates epochs. The Son of Man moves through these seasons with a rhythm that seems both inevitable and merciful, a cadence that underscores ultimate flourishing. Enoch observes that timing matters. Revelation too early can annihilate the soul's capacity to absorb it, while revelation too late ceases to correct the damage already done. These temporal lessons form a backbone to the way divine justice plays out across history. Sometimes the revelations take on the texture of lament, where Enoch mourns not just for singular losses but for a world that has been destabilized. He recites scenes where fathers and mothers sit stunned at the consequences of unseen teaching, where children inherit the tumult of choice they did not make. The Son of Man listens to these laments and bends his judgment with eyes that are both firm and grieving. There is a human sorrow in the cosmic court that reminds the listener that even celestial processes bear emotional freight. Enoch's account does not shy away from the grotesque. It registers the excesses and the confusion with a clear-eyed realism. He records the strange admixtures of flesh and spirit without sensationalism, treating them as realities that demand understanding. The Son of Man handles these cases with gravity, never amused and never flippant, as if each anomaly is a summons to re-examine assumptions about what it means to belong to the created order. The gravity of this approach helps the listener to navigate the more shadow-laden portions of the story. As the narrative unspools, the drama intensifies in the heavenly courtrooms where accusations are presented and verdicts deliberated. Enoch sits as both witness and scribe, writing down the logic of each case, the witnesses called, and how the Son of Man reasons. The process is painstaking and measured, emphasizing that cosmic justice is procedural as well as moral. These legal scenes are not dry, they pulse with high stakes, because outcomes mapped here reach into the living world. There are passages where Enoch descends back into the world to see the consequences of heavenly decrees, a back and forth that makes the story dynamic. He witnesses the reshaping of communities as sentences are carried out and as new guardians take up the work of oversight. These earthly visits are depicted with an artist's eye for detail, the smell of smoke after a settlement is cleared, the hollowness in an emptied hall, the way a child's laughter emerges timidly amidst the ruins. Such scenes underscore the human cost of celestial mismanagement. The Son of Man's voice becomes more pronounced near the narrative's core, not only in judgment but in instruction. He explains not only what must be done but why, offering an ethical scaffolding that seeks to re-educate both angels and humans. His prescriptions are not merely prohibitions, they are alternatives, ways to channel curiosity and skill into tasks that sustain rather than destroy. Enoch receives these teachings with the quiet diligence of one who knows his task is to translate them into the human arena. A recurring motif is the idea of witnesses, beings who record and testify in ways that transcend human testimony. Rivers, stones, and star motions are all summoned as witnesses to a reality that refuses to be lied about. The Son of Man invites such witnesses into court because they are impartial and ancient, and their testimony is a reminder that the world itself keeps accounts. Enoch, learning to listen beyond the sound of human voices, learns to read the testimony of creation. There are moments of humor buried under the severity, small, almost furtive glimpses that humanize the celestial proceedings. Enoch describes a scene where a pompous celestial official is gently corrected in a way that invites a hesitant smile, or where a cosmic creature is embarrassed by its own misunderstanding. These instances do not undermine the story's gravity but rather make it credible, because even the highest courts cannot be entirely free of paradoxical levity. The Son of Man appreciates such moments, using them perhaps to teach humility. Enoch's descriptions of the stars and luminaries are both scientific and narrative, blending an ancient cosmology with a storyteller's warmth. He speaks of orbits as if they were paths trod by faithful messengers and assumptions as if they were customs of the heavens. The Son of Man interprets these movements within a moral framework, suggesting that celestial order mirrors spiritual law. Thus, the reader is offered a way to understand cosmic phenomena not as random mechanics but as meaningful expressions of a moral universe. The Watcher's secrets include the arts of forging and shaping metals, and Enoch details how this knowledge transformed societies into more lethal forms. Weapons become a central element of the narrative because they are the tangible results of forbidden instruction, and their proliferation brings the narrative to a breaking point. The Son of Man confronts this escalation with decisive measures, outlining how the misuse of knowledge draws consequences not only for immediate harm but for the corruption of future generations. This aspect of the story resonates because it demystifies technology as value-neutral and reminds us that purpose matters. There is an intimate scene where Enoch confronts a solitary watcher, a private exchange that isolates the personal over the political. In this encounter, the Watcher is shown not as a caricature but as a being full of longing and confusion, wrestling with consequences it had not fully considered. Enoch does not mock but listens, and the Son of Man uses this testimony to illustrate remorse as a potential avenue for restoration. The moment is quiet but powerful, and it conveys the nuance that even transgressors can be parts of a restorative narrative. Enoch's journeys sometimes take him to places of imprisonment where he sees rebels bound in strange bonds, their forms constricted by the very laws they disregarded. These scenes are grimly detailed, but they function as pedagogical examples how disobedience to cosmic order can result in bondage rather than freedom. The Son of Man explains that these bindings are not merely punitive but protective, a containment meant to halt further harm. That framing makes the imagery less ghoulish and more instructive, making it easier to hold the complexity of justice and mercy in mind at once. The narrative returns to the theme of revelation timing, underscoring the Son of Man's prudence in the dissemination of secrets. He reveals some things gradually, allowing the world to adapt, while he withholds other knowledge for the appointed time. Enoch, often impatient for the full picture, is taught patience as a virtue, and the listener learns that wisdom may require waiting. This tension between urgency and restraint drives much of the story's emotional arc. Enoch also becomes a historian in his own right, chronicling the lineage of deeds and names so that the story of the Watchers will not be swallowed by silence. His records attempt to serve both as warning and as memory, to prevent history from repeating in cycles of repetition. The Son of Man endorses this archival task, understanding that a remembered past is necessary for ethical continuity. In this way, Enoch's writings are positioned as a bridge between generations, a testimony preserved to guide the future. There are apocalyptic moments when the earth itself seems to protest, cracks opening and dust rising like a chorus that echoes the celestial lament. Enoch details these upheavals with a clarity that makes the world feel alive and responsive, as if creation has its own mind and sorrow. The Son of Man's judgments often coincide with such natural signs, reinforcing the sense that moral disorder produces ecological disturbance. This motif compels the listener to link the personal and the planetary in a single moral economy. At times the text becomes meditative, folding into quiet ruminations about the nature of light and the human thirst for understanding. Enoch contemplates how knowledge illuminates but also casts shadows, and he asks whether mankind can bear the glare of ultimate truths. The Son of Man's assurances come as wisdom, that light is not merely a spectacle but a tool for repair. These reflective passages slow the pace, offering space to internalize the lessons we have watched unfold. The narrative does not spare the reader the discomfort of ambiguity. There are lessons Enoch must carry privately, instructions that cannot be fully transmitted without risking distortion. The Son of Man acknowledges the limits of language, reminding both observer and listener that some truths are experienced rather than articulated. This humility makes the account feel honest and prevents the story from becoming a closed system of answers. It leaves room for wonder and ongoing inquiry. Enoch's voice grows more insistent as the stakes rise, his writing becoming urgent where once it was merely descriptive. He presses upon readers the idea that every secret disclosed carries a responsibility of conduct. The Son of Man echoes this insistence with a firmness that is not cruel but resolute, steering listeners toward an ethic of repair and accountability. The repetition of this theme creates a rhythm that the mind can learn to follow. We are shown the destinies of the Watchers in a series of outcomes that are at once particular and archetypal. Some are bound and hidden, others are repurposed as guardians, and a few are left to the open court of time where repentance may or may not come. The Son of Man's handling of each case reflects discernment. Not all require the same remedy, and nuance is applied like a surgeon's touch. Enoch's chronicling of these varied fates offers a panorama of possibilities for anyone who crosses moral lines. There is a striking image of a great tree whose roots interlace with the foundations of earth and whose branches touch the heights, a living emblem of interconnectedness. The tree suffers from the Watcher's meddling, its leaves falling out of season, and Enoch sees it as a symbol of disrupted order. The Son of Man speaks of restoration that begins at the roots, coaxing new shoots through careful tending rather than wholesale destruction. This botanical metaphor grounds the cosmic drama in a tangible image that resonates with human experience. Enoch sometimes writes as though he were teaching a class, pausing to explain principles that underpin celestial jurisprudence. He describes the antecedents of particular decrees and the precedents set by previous ages, making a complex system intelligible. The Son of Man acts as both judge and professor, helping listeners see patterns across time. These explanatory passages provide scaffolding for the more dramatic scenes, helping the listener maintain a coherent sense of the entire narrative. The narrative also explores the psychology of temptation, considering how beings of freedom confront attractions that would derail them. Enoch listens to confessions, to inward monologues of those who fell, and he attempts to map the inner logic of seduction. The Son of Man helps by reframing temptation as a dialogic process, something to be answered with discernment rather than simply resisted. This inward turn adds moral depth to the story, shifting it from spectacle to inner formation. There is a musicality to some of Enoch's visions, a sense that harmonies undergird moral order. He hears choirs of beings articulating cosmic truths, and these songs function as both proclamation and instruction. The Son of Man participates in this music with a voice that organizes and harmonizes discord, bringing various notes into a coherent composition. The metaphor of music helps the listener grasp how disparate elements might be ordered into a beautiful whole. Enoch's journey takes a darker turn when he perceives the long shadow of corruption that lingers after immediate consequences have been enacted. He watches how cultural practices mutate, how some people adapt the Watcher's teachings to exploit rather than to sustain. The Son of Man recognizes these mutations for what they are and presents strategies of undoing and re-education that are both practical and spiritual. The narrative here is less about spectacular punishment and more about durable rehabilitation. There are interludes where Enoch contemplates the future epochs the Son of Man reveals to him, eras of purification and renewal that will follow the storms of transgression. These glimpses are painted with hope, showing a world mending itself through deliberate action and divine accompaniment. Yet the Son of Man insists that this recovery requires human cooperation, a partnering that is as ethical as it is spiritual. Enoch records these promises not as unearned boons but as conditional hopes contingent on repentance and repair. Enoch often returns to the image of walking, emphasizing movement as an ethical and spiritual metaphor. To walk with God, he says, is to choose a steady direction amid enticing detours. The Son of Man models this trajectory, walking among courts and fields, listening and intervening. The symbolism of walking makes the story feel accessible. It links the grand cosmic legislation to the simple human activity of stepping forward in the right direction. As Enoch gathers his notes, the weight of his task becomes clearer, to translate a language of heaven into terms the earth can understand without cheating either. He records ceremonies, contracts, and judgments with a scrivener's devotion, knowing that fidelity to detail matters. The Son of Man supports this labor, providing clarifications and corrections, and the result is a narrative that seeks to teach as much as to proclaim. This dual purpose keeps Enoch's account serviceable across generations. The text offers moments of pastoral care, where the Son of Man tends to those wounded by the Watcher's influence, visiting villages, speaking to the afflicted, and offering remedies. These scenes soften the cosmic severity with images of healing touched by tenderness and expertise. Remedy here is practical, learning new crafts that sustain rather than destroy, and spiritual, reorienting desires toward communal flourishing. The Son of Man's presence in these moments is as much therapeutic as it is judicial. Enoch's narrative rounds back to the idea of testimony, insisting that the act of speaking truth is itself a corrective force. When people testify honestly about what they have seen and done, the community recalibrates its values. The Son of Man fosters environments where truth can be told without fear of immediate annihilation, recognizing that confession and accountability produce healthy repair. This emphasis on testimony reframes the dynamic from punitive exposure to transformative truth-telling. In quieter passages, Enoch is reflective about mortality and continuity, wondering what it means that knowledge outlives individuals and that names endure in archives. The Son of Man reassures him that memory is sacred when it is used to guide rather than condemn, and that legacies can be redeemed through responsible transmission of lessons. These reflections deepen the narrative by connecting cosmic law with human remembrance and responsibility. They prompt listeners to consider how they steward the knowledge they possess. There is a sequence where Enoch watches children who are taught new ways to live, who inherit a culture of restraint rather than a culture of transgression. The Son of Man invests in these young ones, knowing that the formation of their character will shape epochs to come. Enoch takes solace in the small victories, the tiny re-education of appetites, the learning of new trades that nourish rather than harm. Such scenes offer a practical optimism that balances the story's darker episodes. Enoch's final chapters, in a sense, are not a conclusion but a commissioning. He is sent back to the people with the Son of Man's summons to build, to teach, and to guard. The Son of Man delegates responsibilities carefully, ensuring that those who are formed by vision are also fitted with the communal supports needed to sustain change. Enoch becomes a bearer of both warning and hope, an emissary tasked with translating cosmic principles into the rhythms of daily life. There is a lingering echo in the tale, a sense that secrets once revealed must be lived responsibly or they become curses. Enoch's record stands as both testament and manual, a layered text that invites careful reading and faithful practice. The Son of Man's oversight continues through the generations as an ethical presence rather than a distant decree, a reminder that justice seeks restoration as much as retribution. The story thus ends not with a dramatic bang but with a gentle nudge toward ongoing vigilance and care. Even as Enoch's voice quiets at the end of his long account, the stories and warnings he passes on remain urgent, as if the task of guarding the world is perpetual and communal. The Son of Man, in his role as both revealer and preserver, remains an emblem of a justice that is both inevitable and tender. To listen to Enoch is to be asked to watch, to remember, and to act, to become a little more careful with the powers we receive and the secrets we keep. The tale closes with that invitation drifting into the listener's ear like evening wind, patient and persistent. Enoch stood at the edge of human sight, a man who had walked in a world of dust and dawn and then been carried beyond the rim of the sky. He remembered the weight of his sandals, the sound of his breath in the quiet of his tent, the way his children's faces seemed to glow under the evening light. And yet those memories were like fingerprints pressed into the inner surface of a new reality, present but distant, intimations of a life that had been folded into something larger. He had come to the threshold not as a conqueror but as a servant and a witness, curious and trembling in equal measure. When the door of heaven opened before him, it was not a simple portal but a delicate unfastening of realities, a scene where one realm yielded to another. Light moved through that seemed like a river, but it was a light that carried sound and memory, that braided the present and the past together. Enoch found himself drawn into a corridor lined with living radiance, a slow ascent where each step altered the gravity of his thought and the shape of his questions. He felt as if he were being rewritten line by hands he could not see. The angels who accompanied him were not all of one likeness. Some shone with a single steady flame, some with multifaceted glints, and some with a soft, cowled anonymity. They did not speak in the way men converse, with syllables flung into the air, but rather in impressions that settled on Enoch like weather, a cold breeze of caution, a warm current of welcome, a shadowed gust of warning. Their presence rearranged the expectations of his heart, turning fear and awe into a new language that could be measured only by the rise and fall of his chest. He learned quickly that in places of pure light, even thought must be translated. The Son of Man appeared not as a solitary figure but as a distilled authority that made all lesser images cohere around a single center. Enoch had been prepared for majesty, for thunder, and an overwhelming voice, yet the presence before him was precisely balanced between intimacy and dominion. The Son of Man held a kind of courtroom gravity, a quiet that did not crush but clarified, as if the questions Enoch carried were placed on a table and gently illuminated, no longer hidden. Enoch felt the sudden, disorienting rightness of being seen entirely and still being invited to speak. There was a table of light, a plane that extended like polished water under the gaze of the celestial court, and Enoch understood without instruction that his life would be laid out there. He did not feel stripped in humiliation but displayed in a manner that sought truth rather than spectacle. As each memory surfaced, the court did not react with noise or judgmental thunder. Instead, the light around them shifted in hue, a subtle critique or commendation. Enoch's recollections were reviewed with the delicate patience of a master jeweler examining a gem for flaws and deeper brilliance. The trials were not tests in the way men cast lots or wrestle for land. They were exposures to deeper realities that assessed fidelity, intent, and the capacity to hold illumination without being undone. Each trial opened like a seed, outward from a center of simple truth into complex branches of implication. Subjects of the trials included not only acts Enoch had performed but the motives folded underneath them, the small betrayals of pride, the unmarked mercies, the ways his heart had leapt toward compassion. The Son of Man's scrutiny avoided cruelty. It sought to refashion a clarity that would allow Enoch to carry revelation back into the world of men. In one moment of testing, Enoch saw his own youthful arrogance laid out like a thin, brittle thing that had also sheltered him. He remembered a time when he had thought knowledge his shield, a time when he judged men more quickly than he listened to them. The court showed him those instant condemnations not with shame but with the promise of correction, as though it offered him new sight rather than punishment. Enoch felt tears that were not humiliation but relief, tears that seemed to wash his eyes clean so he could truly witness people again. Another trial centered on mercy, and it arrived like a gentle tide that both softened and revealed the hardness concealed underneath. He relived moments where kindness had been withheld by fatigue or fear and saw how those moments rippled outward into consequences he had not foreseen. The Son of Man unfolded the lives affected, showing Enoch how a single withheld word could become a thread that shaped many others. The lesson was not condemnation but responsibility, to see mercy as a force that rewrites futures, not merely as a sentiment that eases the present. At times the trials assumed the form of questions that might have been whispered by his own conscience if that conscience had been bolder. Was your fidelity to truth consistent? Did your love seek the beloved's flourishing or merely the comfort of your attention? Each question opened pathways of memory like doors into rooms whose contents reshaped Enoch's self-understanding. The Son of Man did not require humble speeches, the atmosphere itself encouraged honesty, and Enoch found his defenses dissolving as if the light were a solvent for vanity. The throne room was not featureless, it was a topology of meaning where surfaces gathered and released significance. Columns of understanding rose like trees of glass, each branch an implication of some moral principle that Enoch had once assumed was self-evident. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something that might have once been rain, sense rearranged memory here, making certain recollections snap back into focus with the force of an unexpected bell. There was an economy of details. Objects were not random contributions but articulations of the truths under consideration. One of the most disorienting aspects of Enoch's trial was time itself. It no longer flowed like a river but layered like panes of glass, each pane showing the same place at different moments. He could stand beside his younger self and speak without altering the facts, and the younger self would listen with the peculiar stillness of a man hearing a prophecy about his own heart. The Son of Man allowed this collage of times to be presented not as paradox but as pedagogy, a way for Enoch to see the arc of his choices and how they had compounded into the person before the court. This strange simultaneity was both a mercy and a weight. There were witnesses in the court beyond the Son of Man and the angels, witnesses whose testimony Enoch had not expected to be so decisive. Little things he had thought unimportant, an act of hospitality offered to a tired traveler, a book chosen for a lonely friend, rose like small flames and cast more light than some grand gestures he remembered. Conversely, some of his proud declarations flashed like brittle glass and shattered under their own thinness. In the broad ledger of the trial, the small mercies and the petty vanities each pulled at the final tally in ways that surprised him. Enoch learned that confession here was not forced. It arrived when the light made the truth more desirable than his defenses. Sometimes the Son of Man would do nothing overtly compelling, simply hold a gaze of concentrated mercy, and in that steady silence Enoch found himself offering up the truth like a gift. The court seemed to understand that transformation could not be coerced, only invited, and so the tone of the proceedings was patient to the point of tenderness. He discovered, inch by inch, how surrender in such an environment was not a defeat but a recalibration toward sight. A more harrowing trial confronted Enoch with the consequences of leadership, the ways in which his words and actions had become landmarks for others to navigate by. He saw faces of men and women who had followed his counsel, some to good end and some into hardship he had not intended. The Son of Man unfolded those paths with a care that was almost surgical, showing Enoch where an ill-placed word had become a barrier and where a timely encouragement had become a bridge. The burden of influence became visible as the gravity of a planet, and Enoch realized that shepherding souls required a humility he had sometimes lacked. In another scene, Enoch was shown the court of human imagination where stories take shape and spread like weather patterns. The myths and teachings he had passed along, whether spoken by the fireside or inscribed in the little circles of friends, were displayed with the urgency of living organisms. He watched ideas climb into the air, take root where they pleased, and alter climates of thought. The Son of Man explained, with no need for words, that truth disseminated through human minds could be both resilient and fragile, that once freed it gains a life of its own that can surpass or betray its progenitors. Metaphor was not merely decorative in these trials, it was a methodology. The Son of Man used images, trees, lenses, rivers, to translate eternal principles into forms Enoch could test against remembered reality. When an idea was shown as a lens, Enoch could see how it shaded perception, focusing some things while blurring others. When a choice was pictured as a fork in a path, he could walk down each option and feel their textures beneath his feet. These living metaphors allowed Enoch to turn abstract moral questions into visceral experiences he could not ignore. Enoch was also made to confront the landscape of doubt that had sometimes framed his faith, a terrain of shadows and tentative footholds. Doubt arrived not as an accusation but as a companion waiting to be understood. The court did not require loyalty of him to the point of dishonesty. Instead, the Son of Man offered Enoch a space where questions could be voiced without penalty, and in that open interrogation Enoch discovered the muscular depth that honest questioning builds inside a person. Doubt, when acknowledged and refined, was revealed to be a kind of honesty that could foster a stronger conviction. As the trials progressed, Enoch began to notice that the court itself was evolving with his answers. The light adjusted, the angles of radiance shifted to accommodate newly revealed truth. This was not a manipulative choreography but a reflection of a central principle: understanding begets clarity, and clarity rearranges the terms by which further truth is disclosed. His responses, then, were not recorded in a ledger of immutable facts, but participated in an ongoing shaping of reality. The process felt like being part of a living language rather than an immobile script. He encountered a trial of judgment and forgiveness where the Son of Man presented him with those he had wronged and those who had wronged him. The scenes played with no favoritism, each hurt and each healing emerged in full color. Enoch was invited to re-experience slights and insults, not to be consumed by resentment, but to learn the anatomy of forgiveness. He realized that forgiveness did not erase the past, but altered the way the past guided the future, transmuting bitterness into a kind of quiet strength. There was a trial that concerned silence, an inquiry into the moments he had remained quiet when noise was demanded and times he had spoken where silence would have been wisdom. In that investigation, Enoch saw the consequences of both speech and restraint, how silence can protect and isolate and how speech can harm and liberate. The Son of Man's illumination revealed the ethical geometry of words, where angles of truth could be misapplied and where courage and speech could reshape worlds. Enoch left that trial more attentive to the thresholds of voice and hush. Compassion was tested in scenes that put before him the full gamut of human suffering, from trivial aches to world-bending catastrophes, and then asked what he could do in each case. Sometimes he had the power to act, sometimes he had only the power to witness. The trials clarified that compassions are practiced within constraints, and that the moral universe requires both action and acceptance. Enoch learned that even bearing witness faithfully becomes a kind of mercy when other forms of intervention are impossible. The Son of Man introduced paradox as a teacher, presenting contradictions not to confuse but to deepen comprehension. He held up situations where justice and mercy intersected in complex ways, where an act that seemed righteous had a side effect of harm and where a seemingly improper kindness birthed surprising restoration. These paradoxes functioned like hard knots that needed patient fingers to loosen, encouraging Enoch to cultivate discernment rather than simple formulae. The court prized subtlety, and Enoch's thinking took on new textures because of it. A trial that felt like an interrogation of ambition surprised him by being a quiet conversation about purpose. Scenes of his striving, achievements, honors, and the moments when he pushed for recognition appeared in sunlight, and the Son of Man asked him gently whether his striving had sought his own name or the flourishing of others. Enoch reflected on the ways ambition can be ennobling when aligned with service or destructive when centered on self. The verdict was less a condemnation and more an invitation to aim his energies with a new compass. Memory itself became a subject of inquiry. The Son of Man placed memories under a kind of magnifying lens so Enoch could see not only what he remembered but how memory had rearranged events. Memories had become mythic, and Enoch realized that recollection often dresses reality in the garments of meaning. He saw how the story he told himself about a moment could be kinder or harsher than the moment deserved, and he learned that truthful recollection requires a humility before the rawness of history. The court taught him to retrieve memory with both courage and compassion. There was a silence that arrived like snowfall between trials, a restorative hush in which the angels moved about with soft purpose and the Son of Man allowed Enoch to breathe. In those pauses he would often find small consolations, fragments of song, fragments of childhood bliss, glimpses of faces that had anchored him. The brief respites were strategic. They reinforced that the process of being examined could include renewal. Enoch learned to accept pauses as necessary, not as desertions, and discovered how replenishment can be integral to endurance. In one of the deeper trials, Enoch was asked to reckon with the breadth of creation and his place within it. He saw galaxies unfolded like scrolls, stars woven into fabrics of meaning, and the smallest insects stitched into patterns of purpose. The Son of Man did not scold him for anthropocentrism but rather widened his perspective so that human concerns were seen within a grander web of life. Enoch felt both humbled and entrusted, a species-aware humility that carried within it a renewed sense of responsibility toward the created order. Moral imagination was placed under assessment when the court showed him the futures that different choices could have produced. He stood, as if at the edge of many rivers, watching each current carry possibilities downstream. The Son of Man allowed him to see the consequences rolled out like tapestries, each thread a decision. This garden of potentialities taught him patience in choosing and gravity in living, because choices were no longer private but woven into the tapestry of many lives. As the trials continued, Enoch sensed a transformation happening within his capacity to bear light. Initially, illumination had been something that blinded or dazzled. Now he was learning to hold it without being consumed. The court refined his endurance with exercises that felt less like punitive tasks and more like rigorous rehearsals for a life of seeing. He found his vision steadier, his judgments tempered, and his heart more capacious to carry what he had been given. A trial that touched the essence of sorrow required him to relive grief without collapsing into despair. The Son of Man presented tragedies both old and fresh, and asked Enoch to remain present, to let empathy flood but not to be swept away. Through this discipline, Enoch discovered resilience as a moral muscle that grows by being exercised, not by being avoided. He began to understand sorrow as a teacher that, when engaged with courage, instructs a deeper kind of joy resilient against brittle frivolity. Justice itself was unrolled like a scroll of varied hues. He learned that fairness and retribution are not identical and that mercy can sometimes be the truer form of justice. The Son of Man allowed Enoch to see historical wrongs and the possible mechanisms of redress without simplifying the pain involved. There were no easy formulas for repair, only patient artistry that included truth-telling, restitution, and imaginative rebuilding. Enoch absorbed the complexity with a newfound reluctance to rush to judgment in his own small corner of the world. Enoch was shown visions of governance, scenes of leaders making choices in the tightness of circumstance and the expansiveness of idealism. He observed the clash between the need for decisive action and the humility required to steward others' lives. The Son of Man spoke through a demonstration, showing the balance of firmness and tenderness necessary for just rule. Enoch took these images seriously, seeing in them analogies for spiritual stewardship and the care of congregations, families, and communities. One trial tested the depth of gratitude in his life by laying before him the gifts he had taken for granted. He saw the breath of morning, the warmth of bread, the unseen hands that labored to sustain his daily necessities, and he recognized his prior inattentiveness. This exposure did not leave him mired in guilt. Rather, it cultivated an expansive gratefulness that reoriented his relationships with things and people. Gratitude became a practice he could deliberately enter into, changing the texture of ordinary existence. Faith as a subject was not accepted uninspected. The Son of Man invited Enoch to differentiate between inherited creeds and the lived reality of trust. Creeds are scaffolding, the court suggested, useful and sometimes comforting, but trust is the living structure that bears a person in crisis. Enoch was asked not to abandon tradition but to let his faith be tested by suffering and joy alike so that it might be proven durable. The trial was a purifying fire that changed cold assent into warm dependence. In the quiet of intellectual examination, Enoch faced doctrinal certainties that he had held as if they were unchangeable stones. The Son of Man did not tear these stones down but chipped away at hardened edges, revealing softer cores of mystery. Enoch's mind, once complacent with tidy answers, found new pleasures in ambiguity that invited exploration rather than shutting down thought. Intellectual humility became a virtue he had not expected to prize so highly. Companionship and solitude were weighed together, showing him how each is necessary in the formation of a soul. He watched scenes of deep fellowship, conversations around small fires, the comfort of shared labor and laughter, and then scenes of prayer alone at night where answers were not guaranteed. The court taught him that the soul needs both the mirror of the other's face and the silence of solitary reflection. Harmony between the two was offered as a discipline that kept the heart honest and open. Enoch was asked to confront the nature of prophecy and the burden of foreknowledge, how to speak truth without crushing hope, and to herald coming events without becoming a self-fulfilling doom. The Son of Man revealed the delicate art of prophecy as a kind of calibrated courage, one that recognizes the power words have to shape futures. Enoch learned how to hold warnings and promises together, speaking so that people might be prepared and not paralyzed. Prophecy became, in his view, a careful stewardship of possibility. Scales of loyalty and truth were balanced in an exacting trial where personal ties were tested against higher goods. He watched himself choosing between protecting a friend and revealing an uncomfortable truth, and the court allowed him to feel the sting of both options. The Son of Man guided him to understand that loyalty unexamined can become complicity, while truth without compassion can destroy. Enoch discovered that mature allegiance requires a painful but necessary integration of both fidelity and frankness. The terrain of repentance was expansive and tactile, showing him that turning away from error is not a single act but a vocational reorientation of daily life. The Son of Man's mercy invited him to make small, consistent adjustments, and to see repenting as an ongoing attentiveness rather than a dramatic collapsing at the foot of a shrine. Enoch found that repentance reshaped habits, and habits reshaped character, and a slow alchemy that felt ultimately hopeful. The court sought not a one-time humiliation but a living transformation. He was given glimpses of the kingdom the court sought to nourish, a realm of reconciled differences and flourishing care where wounds are treated and futures are tended. These glimpses were not utopian fantasies but working models, places where the principles of justice, mercy, wisdom, and joy were embodied in the particulars of life. Enoch watched children playing under the protection of elders who understood both firmness and delight, saw markets where goods were exchanged with integrity, and listened to public deliberations that prized truth over rhetoric. The Son of Man let these images be both a critique and an invitation, a critique of what the world was, and an invitation to co-labor in what it could become. A trial of generosity moved him to account for the economy of his heart, where hoarding can seem like prudence and giving like risk. In the celestial ledger, each reluctant gift shone less brightly than a humble offering made with sacrificial joy. Enoch discovered that generosity alters the giver as much as the receiver, reshaping affections and loosening fear. The Son of Man encouraged a generosity that is strategic and tender, an art that makes abundance not only possible but sustainable. Morality as motion was taught through images of walking and journeying, where choices are steps and character is formed step by step. The court made clear that ethics are not a set of static rules but a navigation that requires attention, compass, and willingness to change course. Enoch watched himself on paths that bent toward both ruin and restoration, and the Son of Man's guidance illuminated safer ways forward. He emerged with a sense of moral direction that felt practical and daily rather than theoretical and remote. There were moments when doubt returned like an old tide, and the court met it with the steadiness of faithful companions rather than impatient rebukes. The Son of Man did not diminish the force of Enoch's struggle but showed him how doubt, tended well, can be a doorway to deeper insight. Enoch came to understand that faith and doubt are not enemies but partners in a courageous life of seeking, each sharpening the other. The court's patient methodology cultivated in him a trust that could live with questions. The Son of Man gave him moments of unexpected levity, small scenes where angels laughed like children and the court favored a kind of holy irony that loosened his sternness. These interludes were not trivial. They taught Enoch that joy is not simply the absence of sorrow but a robust horizon that makes endurance possible. Laughter here was an educational tool, a way to prevent the soul from hardening under solemnity. Enoch found himself smiling from a place deeper than relief, an inner gladness that survived trial. A nuanced trial concerned the use of power, the many ways authority might be exercised to harm or to heal. Enoch observed rulers who wielded power as an expression of fear and others who used it as a sacrificial service to protect the vulnerable. The Son of Man insisted that power becomes just when it is tethered to responsibility and accountable by love. Enoch's own understanding of influence deepened. He learned a reverence for restraint as much as for action. Ethical imagination returned when the court asked him to envision the common good not as an abstract slogan but as a living practice in ordinary neighborhoods and workplaces. He saw committees deciding with courage, neighbors sharing resources, and children taught to care rather than to compete. The Son of Man connected macro principles to micro practices, showing Enoch that grand ideals are enacted through mundane integrity. This made the work of change feel accessible and urgent in equal measure. One of the most testing scenes involved sorrow over the innocent, a profound trial that required him to hold anger and compassion simultaneously. The court did not ask for reductive consolation but for a resolute willing to labor for reform and care. Enoch watched systems that oppressed and people who resisted, and learned to let his grief be mobilized into persistent action rather than corrosive rage. The Son of Man's presence converted pain into a driver for justice-laden empathy. He was taught to read the signs of cultural change, to recognize how practices and values shift gradually and how to shepherd communities through those transitions without panic. The Son of Man presented the court as a kind of training ground for adaptive leadership, where history and the needs of the present intersect. Enoch learned to listen to the undercurrents of society, to imagine repair where fragmentation threatened, and to foster resilient traditions that could renew themselves without fossilizing. This was stewardship refined by patient prudence. In a quiet but profound trial, the Son of Man pressed upon him the importance of humility and knowledge, an academic posture that combines curiosity with restraint. Enoch had prided himself on wisdom and yet was shown the ways in which pride and knowing hardens the heart. The court showed him that true wisdom delights in continued discovery and remains eager to be corrected. This lesson grounded his intellect in a humility that made further learning not a threat but an invitation. Love was perhaps the most capacious trial, appearing in myriad forms and demanding an integration of the many virtues he had been taught. The Son of Man modeled a love that is patient, not by sentimentalizing suffering but by deliberately choosing the good of the other. Enoch was asked to test whether his love could stretch to include the difficult, the strange, and the costly. These examinations reoriented his affections into patterns of self-giving that felt both dangerous and beautiful. At unexpected intervals, the court offered him prophetic imagination about the end of cycles, scenes where decay and redemption mingle, and finalities are both mourned and anticipated. Enoch observed endings that are not merely destruction but stages in a larger reshaping, and the Son of Man taught him to hold eschatology as both hope and ethical imperative, an incentive to live rightly now. The trials transformed apocalyptic speculation into practical ethics, urging immediate care in view of ultimate outcomes. Enoch discovered that beauty itself is a teacher in the court, a force that gathers fragmented hearts into wholeness simply by being present. The Son of Man allowed him to linger on images of artistry, music, and the tender arrangements of daily life that make living meaningful. Beauty reframed his conception of duty as something not merely onerous but luminous. He began to see that cultivating beauty in small places is a form of faithful resistance to a world that flattens wonder. The trials were cumulative, not merely a succession of isolated scenes, and gradually Enoch noticed a new coherence forming in his soul. The habits the court encouraged began to settle into rhythm: attentiveness, confession, repair, action, and delight in beauty. The Son of Man's pedagogy worked like seasons, reshaping a landscape rather than a single surgical intervention. Enoch felt his life being rewritten in slow but sure increments. One of the final trials involved the handing back of memory in a transformed shape, where the court returned his life story not as a list of missteps but as a narrative of redemption in progress. Enoch saw his life not as a closed ledger but as an open text into which new chapters could still be written. The Son of Man did not erase hardship but reframed it as material for a resilient testimony. This restorative recounting gave Enoch a confidence to return to the world with renewed mission. The angels, who had been part of his entourage throughout, now moved with a lighter step, their function shifting from guardianship to companions on a continuing road. They no longer needed to escort him through each corridor of light with the same intensity. Instead, they accompanied him as partners who had shared a long apprenticeship. Enoch understood this change as a sign of advancement, not abandonment but trust in his newly acquired steadiness. Their presence now felt like confirmation of learning rather than surveillance. Before leaving the court, Enoch was given a vision of the Son of Man not only as judge and teacher but as companion in labor, a figure who stands beside those who enter into the slow work of repair. The Son of Man's face was calm and intent, communicating a solidarity that did not lessen the seriousness of the trials but made participation in them feel less lonely. Enoch accepted this solidarity with both gratitude and the immediate sense of responsibility it entailed. He could leave the heavenly hall knowing he was not alone in the work ahead. There was a final quieting where the Son of Man imparted a simple charge: to carry the light he had received into ordinary places without theatricalism, to find the small points where illumination might heal. Enoch felt the truth of this smallness as profound. The greatest miracles sometimes look like a neighborly kindness or a well-timed word. The court had not trained him for spectacle but for faithful presence in the world's ongoing struggles. With this simple commission, he felt equipped to return. When Enoch descended from the threshold, the material world did not seem diminished but rather more vividly textured, as if the colors were deeper and the contours clearer. He found himself noticing details that used to slip past: the exact shade of a child's hair in morning light, the tired but steady walk of a neighbor, the small acts of courage unnoticed by most. The trials had not removed the world's suffering, but they had sharpened his capacity to respond with both wisdom and love. He returned as a man who had been remade within the economy of luminous judgment and tender instruction. Enoch's life after the court carried an urgency different from anxious hustling. It was a settled purpose that moved like a river fed by deep springs. He cultivated practices that kept his vision clear, moments of quiet reflection, a willingness to be confronted by friends, and a humble attentiveness to the needs that surfaced in his community. The Son of Man's trials did not leave him complacent. They left him vigilant and joyful in equal measure. His days were threaded with a new patience, energetic, steady, and kind. Often he would pause to recall specific moments from the trials, not as trophies to flaunt but as touchstones that recalibrated him when the world pushed him toward cynicism. He remembered the way light had rearranged a painful memory into a lesson, the way laughter had softened awe into human intimacy, and the way sorrow had redirected him toward action. These recollections became a private liturgy, a reservoir of grace he could draw on in moments of despair or doubt. They kept his soul from fraying under ordinary pressures. Enoch found himself sharing not doctrines but stories, small narratives of mercy and consequence that invited others to consider their own paths. He did not seek to indoctrinate but to open imaginations to the possibility of transformation. The Son of Man's pedagogy had taught him that stories often do what admonition cannot. They allow listeners to enter into moral reasoning by inhabiting another's shoes. Enoch became a teller of careful tales, knowing that nuance invites reflection more reliably than preachiness. The court's lessons continued to shape his relationships, making him less consumptive of people's affections and more deliberate in investing his time. He grew to value depth over breadth in friendships, preferring a few ties of seriousness to many of convenience. The Son of Man had shown him the moral worth of steady presence, and Enoch practiced it enthusiastically, knowing that constancy can outwork charisma in forming lasting flourishing. People around him felt the difference and were quietly altered by it. At times, the memory of the throne returned with a gentle recoil, a sense of awe that raised his voice in prayer without forcing it. He would stand beneath ordinary skies and feel that same gravitational pull, a reminder that the divine presence continues to orbit his life even in the low valley of chores and obligations. The court's lessons were not confined to a single high place, but flowed into the quotidian with a steady insistence. Enoch learned to live under that light without being consumed by it. Gradually, the Son of Man's image in his mind shifted from an intimidating figure of verdict to a reliable partner in moral endeavor. The court's gravity became a source of courage rather than dread, and Enoch's inner life moved from performance to authenticity. He embraced a maturity that took responsibility seriously while trusting that mercy would accompany frank accountability. The trials had formed a backbone of integrity and a heart enviably tender. Enoch's later years were marked by a willingness to engage with complexity without flinch, to bear children's confessions and to support elders in grief, and to speak truth to power with steadiness rather than spectacle. He became a quiet exemplar of a life shaped by trials of light, a person who had been trained to see and to act with calibrated compassion. People who met him felt the echo of a courtly illumination in his calm responses and straightforward counsel. He was, in small ways, a vessel of something that had once been conferred in halls of radiance. Even as his body aged, the lessons of the throne rippled through his decisions. He chose endings for his relationships and projects with a new integrity, refusing to leave matters unresolved when a compassionate repair was possible. Enoch's final acts were not romantic gestures but ordinary ministrations performed with exceptional dignity, mending fences, speaking reconciliatory words, and ensuring that burdens were shared. The Son of Man's instruction had translated into practical stewardship, manifest in the mundane duties of a life well lived. Toward the end, Enoch found himself less interested in being remembered for great feats and more concerned with whether the people he loved were held and taught well. His concern was not merely for reputations but for the ongoing health of communities, the cultivation of practices that would outlast him and continue forming persons in justice and mercy. He recited the things he had learned with a consistent humility, transmitting not a polished dogma but an apprenticeship ethos. Those who listened were often surprised by the simplicity and depth of his counsel. Finally, when the time arrived for another transition, Enoch did not leave in haste but with the calm of a man who has been readied for departure by long preparation. The Son of Man's final instructions were not dramatic, they were practical and intimate, reminders to continue the small, faithful labors that stitch communities together. Enoch's last steps were made with a gratitude that had become habit, a steady gratitude that did not deny pain but carried it within a larger hope. The light that had once tested him now accompanied him home. Thus Enoch's trials before the throne were not a single performance but a lifelong schooling that reformed his attention, reshaped his affections, and furnished him for work in the world. The Son of Man had been both judge and midwife, giving birth to a new pattern of seeing and acting in him. Enoch's story, as revealed in the court, became a parable for anyone who seeks to carry light into places of darkness, not by blinding force but by steady, practiced clarity. In the end, the trials of light had made him a keeper of humble luminescence. When listeners consider Enoch's journey, they may find in it neither simple triumph nor unalloyed failure but the messy, hopeful work of formation. Those who drive, cook, or hum to the rhythm of life can hear in his story an encouragement to allow their own small practices to be tested and refined. The Son of Man's courtroom is not distant but present whenever honesty, compassion, and courage are asked for and exercised. Enoch's life invites us to approach our own thresholds with curiosity and the willingness to be remade. The echoes of the trials linger in the ordinary rhythms of life, where choices are daily and the stakes, for all their apparent smallness, accumulate into legacies. Enoch's example is not a template to copy but a map to consult. Examine motives, attend to the small mercies, learn to stand under light without flinching. The Son of Man's pedagogy in his case teaches that transformation is patient and persistent, not instantaneous and flashy. There is a grace in this steadiness that quietly changes the world. So the story continues in each heart willing to be examined, and every small goodness faithfully enacted, and the tiny ways people choose to be generous and just. Enoch's trials offer a model for how to live under illumination, with courage to confess, patience to learn, and the humility to be corrected. The Son of Man's presence, as depicted in these scenes, is less a distant verdict and more a companioning force that invites persistent moral growth. Enoch's life stands as testimony to the work of being reformed by light. There is a hush to the beginning of stories that travel through time, a hush that follows the first name spoken before dawn. Imagine a page that breathes, ink lifting into the air as if the letters themselves are waiting for a voice to call them into being. This is the kind of hush that surrounds the Book of Eternal Names, a text half remembered in the dreams of mountains and half whispered in the prayers of strangers. From that hush comes the figure of Enoch, who walks at the edge of human maps and divine charts alike. He is a man who did not die in the ordinary way, whose path leads toward a horizon other people only glimpse in fevered vision. Enoch walks with a steady curiosity, a ledger of names tucked beneath his arm, and in his footsteps the ground remembers new words. We speak of names because names are the first tools of belonging and of power. When a name is spoken, the world listens, it reshapes itself around that sound and takes on new weights and possibilities. The Book of Eternal Names proposes that there are names older than the language people use in market squares and courtrooms, names scribbled in a register kept by whatever god or gods manage destiny. The Son of Man appears in these pages with a quiet contrast to Enoch's itinerant mystery, a figure both intimate and cosmic. The title itself, Son of Man, sits like a promise and a question at once. It suggests a human lineage, and also a station in the heavens, a bridge between flesh and star. In Enoch's company, the Son of Man becomes a mirror and a destination, reflecting mortal longing while pointing toward an ordered, luminous rule. As we move through this story, know that the Book of Eternal Names is not a single sealed volume but a braided tradition, strands of memory woven over centuries. Some of those strands are carved into stone tablets and others into fragile scrolls, and the voice of the book changes with each scribe who translates it. Yet the central pulse remains, a conviction that names matter deeply, and that one man's ascent can redraw the map between heaven and earth. Enoch's fame in the ancient world begins with genealogies and oral rumor, with the name Enoch itself rolling like a pebble from the lips of farmers and kings. In one memory he is a patriarch counted among the generations, a link in a chain. In another he is a seer who learned to read the mechanics of the sky. Both memories are true in their way, and both feed into the imagining of a book that collects the eternal registry of things seen and unseen. The Son of Man title, by contrast, travels along a different road, appearing in visions that smell of incense and in oracles delivered by trembling lips. It is cast in a richer, more enigmatic light in the apocalyptic horizons, where time is a spool and the end is closer than anyone wishes to admit. For those who encountered it in the shadow of the temple or among the exiles, the Son of Man promised not merely a deliverer but an accountant of justice, one who would read names from a book and weigh them against the acts recorded in a life. Enoch's journey to the place of the Holy Council is described with precise strangeness, as if a cartographer had attempted to map the architecture of Revelation. He passes through gardens that are not gardens, through doors that open into arithmetic, and into assemblies where beings made of light conduct the affairs of the cosmos. He learns that the naming of things is the infrastructure of order, and that to speak a name in the right register is to set a star in its course. The Book of Eternal Names, within these accounts, is sometimes literal and sometimes a metaphor wearing many disguises. At times it appears as a volume of parchment whose pages bear the signatures of angels and the fates of nations. Then again it takes the shape of a ledger in the sky, the constellations themselves arranged like letters in a celestial script, reminding listeners that every story is written twice, once on earth and once above. There is an intimacy to the act of naming that feels almost parental, and Enoch learns this intimacy as if in a teacher's embrace. He discovers that the names of winds and rivers can be called out, and they will answer. He learns that even sorrow and joy have formal appellations that can be invoked to soothe or summon them. This is not mere lexicon, it is stewardship, the stewardship of reality through a vocabulary that is older than monuments. As the Son of Man becomes a figure in Enoch's revelations, he is presented with titles and tasks that balance tenderness with authority. He is called to judge the unjust and to vindicate the meek, and yet he carries the soft gravity of someone who recognizes the weight of a single human name. That balance is central to the Book of Eternal Names because judgment without remembrance is cruelty, remembrance without justice is sentiment. Scholars and story keepers argue about whether the Son of Man is an individual, an office, or a poetic way of naming an event that transforms history. But within the narrative world that follows Enoch, the figure is both specific and symbolic, someone to whose presence the cosmos must answer. The Son of Man becomes a hinge in which human fragility meets cosmic governance, a place where the ledger is not only read but reconciled. Enoch's ascent is framed by encounters with angels whose duties are catalogs unto themselves, beings who seem to be clerks of both wonder and order. They show him the machinery behind seasons and laws, and they hand him keys that open metaphysical safes. It is through these handoffs that the idea of a book that holds eternal names makes sense as something tangible, like a trunk kept in a sacred office where every name is a lock and every lock has a rationale. The notion of an eternal register transforms personal names into coordinates in a larger moral geography. Each name is a place a person holds within the divine map, and each place is subject to the tides of mercy and consequence. Enoch watches as names that were once curved into life by kindness can be eroded by negligence, and he learns that remembrance is not only benevolence but also an obligation to maintain the fidelity of creation. Move with me now into the texture of Enoch's days, where the ordinary and the apocalyptic share a single sky. He stands beside plowing oxen and also before councils that debate the fate of ages, and both scenes are lit by the same persistent curiosity. That curiosity is how the Book of Eternal Names becomes legible to human hearts, not as cold doctrine, but as a practice of noticing. Within those councils Enoch sees the Son of Man seated amid a chorus of witnesses, and there is an ease to his presence that belies the magnitude of his role. He speaks with measured words as if reading a list of lives with reverence, and the voices around him echo in agreement or sorrow depending on the names he calls. The Son of Man's authority functions less like a gavel and more like a seal pressed gently to each destiny. We should consider for a moment what it means to be named by an eternal ledger rather than by the ephemeral titles of society. When a person is known only by age, rank, or wealth, their identity is tethered to tides that will shift. But when their name is written in a book that predates cities, there is a sense of continuity, a lineage that whispers, "You are part of a story that will outlast the hour." Yet the Book of Eternal Names does not guarantee an easy immortality, it imposes a righteous accountability. To occupy a name within its pages is to be answerable to a grammar of actions and consequences, to recognize that freedom comes with a narrative thread that ties acts to ultimate reckoning. Enoch's vision of such a ledger is both consoling and sobering, because it suggests a universe where memory itself is not arbitrary. The Son of Man appears in Enoch as an emissary of that memory, one who can call the names that matter and thereby restore order when chaos erupts. He is a figure who knows how to unfasten knots of history and to weave them anew, recognizing both the crime in our mistakes and the possibility of redemption. Around him the angels set their faces like torches, and the scales that weigh lives glow with a patient light. Enoch's notebooks, as told in the tradition, become a kind of rehearsal for the final accounting, a means by which the human mind learns the heavenly alphabet. He practices reading names aloud and interpreting the way they alter weather and fate, and in doing so he learns empathy for how fragile identity can be. Those who write names down commit themselves to remembering one another across seasons of exile and forgetfulness, and this is the quiet sacrament of the book. The texture of sound is central to naming in these visions. Names are meant to be heard as much as they are to be recorded. Enoch learns that certain syllables resonate with the bones of the earth while others stir the attachment of stars, and the Son of Man uses this knowledge as a kind of liturgy. To speak a name in full is to awaken the memory that keeps the cosmos functioning, as if language were the pulse that energizes law and compassion. We move now into discussion of authority, because Enoch's narrative insists that those who keep names cannot be passive custodians. The stewardship of memory requires decisions, and the Son of Man is depicted as one who must decide for the sake of balance. He is a judge who remembers faces and stories, and through that remembrance he refuses to reduce lives to statistics. Alongside judgment, mercy is a constant companion in these pages, sometimes subtle as a hand on a shoulder and other times sweeping as the tide reclaiming the shore. The Son of Man embodies a discipline that does not deny suffering but seeks to transform it into a place of healing. Enoch learns that memory without mercy hardens into bitterness, and mercy without memory dissolves into forgetfulness. The apocalyptic imagery that colors Enoch's visions can be eerie and beautiful, like the hush before a storm and the strange calm after. There are thunderous proclamations and soft reconciliations, and the Book of Eternal Names holds them in tension. In the middle of those contrasts, Enoch walks like a mediator who knows how to listen to the thunder while tending to the whisper that follows. Consider the scene where Enoch stands before a host of angels and reads a name that has been lost to time, the sound bringing a forgotten soul back into relation. The reaction is immediate, a slow return of light, a ripple across a hidden river, a small country of memory reconstituted. This is the radical faith of the book, that restoration is possible when someone refuses to let a name vanish without tribute. Yet the narrative does not sugarcoat the consequences of moral failure. The ledger records misdeeds with a clarity that testifies to a moral fabric in the universe. The Son of Man's role is to balance this ledger, not to flatten it into moral easy answers. He reads tragedies and triumphs with the same gravity, and that steady attention is what gives the Book of Eternal Names its weight. As the story expands into different religious and cultural landscapes, the figure of Enoch morphs into multiple reflections, each culture seeing in him something that matches its concerns. In one setting he is a guide for prophets, in another he is a blueprint for mystical ascent, and elsewhere he becomes a symbol for the scholar who keeps sacred memory. That plurality is part of his legacy. He becomes a mirror in which communities find a language for the sacral act of naming. Across centuries, the Son of Man too adapts to new accents and dialects while maintaining a core of authority and compassion. To Christian readers, he may appear as a precursor of Christ-like judgment. To other groups, he symbolizes a transcendent judge who acts in a juridical and restorative capacity. In every register, he holds a place where the human and divine meet, a corridor where the past is not merely recalled but judged and redeemed. If we slow down to listen to the tonal quality of these narratives, we notice how often they return to domestic images, tables, lamps, gardens, despite their cosmic scope. That juxtaposition is intentional, as if to say that the management of eternity depends on how someone treats bread and company. Enoch's lessons are given in simple scenes as much as in celestial courts, reminding the listener that the eternal is woven through the grain of ordinary life. The Book of Eternal Names also contains a language of secrecy and revelation, for the knowledge of names is not meant to be vulgarized. Some secrets are guarded by angelic hierarchies with patience and care, and Enoch is initiated into those mysteries gradually. This process respects the risk inherent in certain knowledge, conveying that true power requires discipline and humility. In revealing some names, the Son of Man exercises not dominion but invitation, inviting creation into a fuller knowing of itself. He does not mutilate the self by announcing it across great stages, rather he restores persons to their own histories so that each life might be coherent. That ethic of restoration becomes the heartbeat of the text, a rhythm by which communities are remade. You may wonder how the idea of an eternal book influenced rituals and prayer. It shaped liturgies that called out names of saints and ancestors, recitations designed to maintain the chain of memory. Communities developed habits of speaking names aloud in services and during times of grief, as if to place troubled souls back into the ledger where they could be seen and held. The symbolism extended into art and iconography, where the Book of Eternal Names is sometimes depicted as an open codex with letters like constellations, and the Son of Man is painted with the serenity of one who keeps watch. These images became tectonic in their influence, giving people visual vocabulary for a theology of remembrance and accountability. Artists found in Enoch's visions a language that could render invisible histories visible to the eye. Across the centuries, poets and mystics took up the motif of the eternal book and reworked it into private devotions and public anthems. They imagined Enoch at a desk of stars, writing with ink that is light, and the Son of Man reading with hands that do not tremble. These metaphors carried spiritual disciplines into everyday breath, making the practice of naming both sublime and practical. The motif also traveled beyond its birthplace into other faith traditions, where echoes of the book and its characters appear in surprising places. In some tales, Enoch's ascent mirrors prophets who cross thresholds into other realms. In others, the Son of Man's role is akin to cosmic adjudicators in neighboring mythologies. These exchanges show how a powerful idea can migrate, morph, and enrich distant landscapes without losing its core insistence on the gravity of names. Within philosophical circles, the Book of Eternal Names has provoked debates about identity and continuity, prompting thinkers to ask whether a person is identical to the name they bear. Enoch's account implies that identity includes memory, and that remembering someone is a moral act that sustains them. The Son of Man's judgments then become philosophical procedures for maintaining the coherence of persons through time. We cannot skip the darker corners of these narratives where names are misused as tools of oppression, and where memory itself becomes weaponized. Tyrants have used prying into names to erase opponents, and the book's imagery warns against reducing names to metadata that can be leveraged for control. Enoch's role here is corrective. He teaches that true naming respects dignity and resists the cataloging of persons as mere objects to be managed. There is also a psychological tenderness to Enoch's work in the stories, the idea that people need to be seen to flourish. The Book of Eternal Names insists that being remembered heals a particular loneliness, a loneliness born of being uncounted. The Son of Man practices a justice that cures that loneliness by restoring each person to a place of acknowledged belonging. When we look at contemporary echoes, we find the pattern of the Book of Eternal Names in archives, libraries, and even memorial walls, places where societies commit to remembering. The logic of those institutions owes something to the vision that people and events matter beyond a single lifetime. Enoch's legacy, translated into civic practice, becomes a cultural habit of anchoring histories and making claims on future witnesses to hold memory safe. The book's influence also extends into how individuals craft their biographies, the stories we tell about ourselves in letters, journals, and memoirs. To name a pain or a joy in a diary is a private act of the same order as writing a name in an eternal ledger. It is an act of survival and continuation, a small but significant confirmation that one belongs to a storyline larger than the present moment. Even the metaphors used in psychotherapy and pastoral care sometimes reflect the logic of Enoch's vision, speaking of recovery as the process of remembering the scattered parts of a life. In these moments, the Son of Man's role as a reconciler of fragments finds a gentle echo, as therapists and spiritual guides help people reclaim lost names and reunite exiled parts of themselves. Such practices suggest that the book's spirit has slipped into modern forms of healing. We should also trace the ways in which the Book of Eternal Names grapples with collective memory, with nations and peoples who choose what to remember and what to erase. Enoch's revelations urge a communal ethic. Societies are judged by their willingness to name their wrongs and to keep the names of the vulnerable. The Son of Man's standard is not ritual purity alone, but the courage to include the excluded in the great ledger of human dignity. Consider now the narrative technique of the book itself, which often layers vision upon vision, memory upon memory, creating a palimpsest where earlier inscriptions remain faint beneath newer writing. This writing style imitates the theme: names never vanish entirely but leave traces beneath later eras. For listeners, this palimpsest creates a sense of depth, as if each name echoes through multiple ages and reshapes every subsequent line. Within ritual communities, the act of naming has procedural forms, liturgies that combine remembrance with proclamation, and songs whose refrains function like icons. These practices are practical ways of keeping the ledger alive in living memory. They are habits calibrated to resist forgetting. The Son of Man appears in these scenes as a patron of public remembrance, a figure who endorses communal rituals of restoration. The Book of Eternal Names also interacts with the ethics of time in ways that challenge hurried cultures. It teaches patience, because names are not reclaimed in an instant, they are restored through long breaths and persistent tests of loyalty. Enoch's patience becomes a model for cultural persistence against the eroding forces of neglect and historical amnesia. We arrive at a place where mysticism and law join hands, where naming theology informs jurisprudence and spiritual practice encourages humane governance. The Son of Man becomes not only an eschatological character but a principle for everyday justice, one insisting that the dignity of persons be recorded and affirmed. Enoch's legacy is the insistence that this principle be enacted on both altars and courts. The book also poses difficult questions about concealed names, those fragments of identity that are intentionally hidden for protection or survival. Sometimes secrecy is mercy, and sometimes it is deception. The ledger cannot always distinguish without human discernment. Enoch's explorations teach us to respect boundaries while refusing to allow secrecy to be an excuse for harm. As time passes, the Book of Eternal Names is interpreted by communities under duress, people who need memory as an anchor amid exile and persecution. For them, the book is not theoretical but life-sustaining, a promise that they are not lost to history. The Son of Man is imagined as their advocate in the heavenly court, a witness who insists that their names remain counted. Modern retellings sometimes recast Enoch and the Son of Man through metaphors of digital archives and data servers, contemplating what it would mean for names to be preserved in code rather than parchment. In these metaphors we find anxieties and hopes that technology may save names from oblivion, and also that naming might be reduced to transactional entries. Enoch's message remains a cautionary voice about the ethics that must govern any method of preservation. We should also explore the personal interiority that the book nurtures, how individuals cultivate the habit of calling the names of those they love into daily prayer. This practice is a private echo of the cosmic ledger, a way to keep someone alive in one's thoughts and deeds. The Son of Man, in such intimate scenes, is less a judge than a confidant who honors the quiet work of remembrance. In artistic terms, the book and its characters inspired a particular aesthetic, one that favored luminous edges and stark interiors in painting, music that used silence as structure, and poetry that counted syllables like beads. Artists used these tools to mirror the ledger's contour and to evoke the feel of names as weights and lights. These creative responses became part of the book's afterlife, showing its capacity to influence hearts as well as minds. The question of authority inevitably leads to controversies about who gets to name and who is named. Power can capture the act of naming and use it to exclude or to subjugate, and Enoch's tales serve as a critique of such monopolies. The Son of Man in these stories becomes an advocate of democratized remembrance, someone whose reading of the ledger refuses to privilege force over fidelity. The doctrine of eternal names also sparked theology of covenant and intercession, where advocates on earth pray on behalf of the marginal and the forgotten. Enoch's intermediary role is echoed here, not as a claim to replace divine justice, but to practice faithful intercession that aligns human compassion with celestial economy. The Son of Man models the posture of advocacy that invites humans into cooperative stewardship rather than passive witnessing. Now imagine listening to these stories on a long road, the sound of tires like prayer against asphalt as the narrative unspools. The pace of Enoch's revelations fits travel. They are composed of small, memorable images that sustain thought over miles. The Son of Man's judgments, too, are rhythmic and measured, offering a cadence that comforts and compels the listener to remain attentive. There are moments in the tradition where Enoch's voice becomes intensely personal, perhaps when he stands before the threshold of forgotten names and trembles with the same fear anyone feels when facing loss. Those moments grant the listener a point of entry, a place of empathy that legitimizes the cosmic scale of the rest. When the Son of Man speaks, his voice softens for such moments, revealing an ethic of tenderness within the administration of cosmic order. We must also consider how rituals of naming can be subverted for creative ends, like poets who invent names to render new realities. The Book of Eternal Names thus becomes a composer's score for a future world. By calling something into being with a name, one can chart the possibility of change. Enoch's role here is not merely to preserve, but to inspire the act of naming as an act of hope. The narrative also addresses the tension between fate and freedom, the idea that a name might predetermine a character while still allowing the person bearing it to act freely. Enoch's visions suggest a dynamic where names embed tendencies and potentials but do not erase agency. The Son of Man reads possibilities into the ledger rather than locking them down, fostering a vision of destiny that is responsive to moral courage. There are passages where the book seems to sigh, where the register itself calls out for repair because there are lacunae, gaps where names should be and are not. Enoch takes upon himself the work of filling those gaps, tracking down the lost syllables and resurrecting them through ritual and testimony. The Son of Man blesses such work, as it reinstates persons into the chain of communal memory and accountability. As the tradition migrates into modernity, the metaphor of the ledger finds reflection in legal records and systems of human rights that try to codify the dignity of persons. The Book of Eternal Names influences the idea that certain truths should be indelible, and that public memory has an ethical function. Legal frameworks owe a moral debt to this imagination when they insist on recording the names of victims and the responsibilities of perpetrators. There are, inevitably, speculative interpretations that imagine the ledger as cosmic software, with angels as administrators and the Son of Man as a supreme algorithm of justice. While such metaphors can feel anachronistic, they reveal a perennial human desire to understand how memory is structured and managed. Enoch's ancient intuition, that names are anchors in a sea of vain experience, remains surprisingly adaptable to these modern mindscapes. Across the narrative, the oldest of Enoch's lessons persist, that attention matters, and that names contain commitments. He models a life that is attentive to the small facts and to the cosmic registers, blending domestic fidelity with transcendent responsibility. The Son of Man validates that mixture by demonstrating that cosmic governance is not abstract but intimately related to how we treat each other. As we near the close of this long breath of storytelling, there is no finality so much as a call to continued stewardship. The Book of Eternal Names is a living project, and its legacy is the shared task of keeping names alive. Enoch's footsteps still echo, and the Son of Man's ledger continues to be read aloud in places where people refuse to let memory die. The invitation extended by both is simple and persistent: to speak each other's names with care and to let those names shape the world in which we live. And so the story continues in each generation, a quiet multiplication of acts of remembrance that defies easy closure. Enoch's wandering becomes our own pilgrimage when we choose to honor the unnamed and to speak with courage. The Son of Man remains a figure who draws us into a practice of justice and mercy where every name matters, and in that practice the Book of Eternal Names endures as a testament to the power of remembering. This story keeps living through all of us, and every act of memory and courage. Subscribe and tell us in the comments if you feel that call inside you too, to remember the forgotten or to stand for those whose names still wait to be spoken.